Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. How you guys doing today? Thanks for tuning in once again. Appreciate you guys making the time to be here again. And today, I just wanted to go over, do a little review for educational purposes. Discussion, commentary, overall learning, and trying to understand everybody here in true history. We're gonna get into this book. We've got into a lot of this book before, parts of it. We're doing a review, going over probably whole chapters, and see what we gotta pull out of here. Pull out the babies. We dodge the hijacks, of course, just like in the title. That's a big hijack, but this book is called Africans and Native Americans. By Africans, they just mean Negroid people. All right. The language of race and the evolution of red black peoples. All right, this is by Jack D. Forbes. Shout out to Jack Forbes, all right, for doing this great research, bringing these great articles out for people to go ahead and understand things a little better, have a little more context when it comes to, these terms, these classifications of races and colors and all that. In his time, though, right? This is from the 1990s, guys, or even 80s, I think. So, ever since then, we've learned a lot more. So, again, we pull out the babies and we dodge the hijacks. We're going to go to a specific chapter of this book since we haven't really gone over the whole thing. We've read parts of it. And that is chapter 4 of this book. And it's called Loros, Pardos and Mestizos, classifying brown peoples, all right? Couple colored peoples, brown complexion peoples. Ain't you brown? So we gone over the word loro, which in Spanish loro or lora, is like saying parrot. And there's a reason the pirates were depicted as pirates, because a lot of the pirates were so-called black or Loros, which means dark complexion. I'll show you guys. That's probably going to mention that today. So it says, aspects of color perception, cultural and individual variation. Says the classification of human beings according to their skin color and other physical characteristics is a very important subject, but one which has yielded a great deal of confusion and controversy. One of the basic problems involved arises from the concept of color itself, and for humans from the problem of describing intermediate colors, that is, those failing between the extremes of white and so-called black. This difficulty may well arise from the weakness of certain languages in terms of their lacking appropriate words, as well as in the complex philosophical and physical issues surrounding the nature of the perception of color. Okay, perceptions of color. It is to be understood that even as the Inuit Eskimo languages have very fine distinctions relating to ice and snow, distinctions totally lacking in many languages, so too we may find languages which fail to make distinctions for a whole range of colors typical of human skin. We may find instead a very unsatisfactory use of a few overworked words such as yellow, white, and black, all right, all crayon colors, which are applied to colors which other cultures might perhaps see as not being at all yellow, white, or black. You guys see? Makes a great point there. To some people, hey, this person might be black or this person might be so-called white or yellow, but to others it might not. Perception. It may well be that most color terms evolved in connection with such practical tasks as one would find it in the tattooing and painting of the body, or later, the painting of cave walls, murals, statues, canvases, dyeing of cloth, and so on. In any case, all of these practices would involve the use of dyes or pigments which, by their very nature, are of a different order from the colors of the human skin. Black and white, when mixed as pigments, may produce gray. All right? So is there a bunch of gray people out there since people are being called white and black? Are they having gray offspring? But when black and white humans mix, the result is usually some type of brown. All right, some type of brown. Make it make sense. If you're going according to crayon colors, then shouldn't there be a lot of gray people then, and not brown? They're producing brown people, huh? In any case, we can argue that most of or all color terms developed to describe practical uses, of which the classification of human beings was not one. All right, it shouldn't be used for human beings to classify human beings. Moreover, color terms native to a particular language seem to often be relatively few in number and are often used symbolically to stand for a range of shades or objects. For example, the greengrocer sells greens, grunten, which are often not green at all, but which can be purplish, grayish, reddish, multicolored, and so on. Thus, green has come to symbolize the world of growing vegetable things, as well as many other things, envy, the green light, and so on. It would appear that people living in the Mediterranean zone developed an early awareness of different human skin colors, as witnessed to ancient Kemi, Egyptian mural paintings showing the majority people of Kem, the black land, as reddish brown, all right, reddish brown, copper colored, huh? And other peoples as darker brown, or black, light, or reddish white, huh? And so on. Other groups, such as the Hellenes, Greeks, so called Greeks, remember, these are all terms and tags too. Canaanites, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, all right, so a lot of these Phoenicians, Carthaginians are Hebrew people, not just Hamites or Canaanites, right? People coming out of Canaan are called Canaanites too. A lot of them could be Israelites or Hebrews. Just talking about the place they're coming out of. So there's a lot of confusion when translated into modern stories, right? And so-called Greeks includes many different nations as well. So you guys know that, the background that we've gone over before. All right, but you understand what he's saying, right? And Romans must also have been aware of intermediate shades between black and white, although perhaps not always, being concerned with fine distinctions. The Arabic language, on the other hand, developed a number of terms for human skin color. So they're saying ancient people wasn't really paying attention to that, or they don't really, write about it like that. They're not really classifying people going by color. That's very important to understand, because if everybody was mostly melanated, they wouldn't have to, right? Or if it wasn't about color, everything wasn't about color, people ruling because they're a certain color, and they wouldn't be worrying about that. But when it comes to the Arab world, after the 1500s, for example, we find these correspondences between Castilian and the Arabic of Granada, beginning with darker shades and proceeding toward lighter. The Arabic being written in the then current Castilian orthography. So Arabic written in Castilian orthography, huh? Negro, black, and these parentheses, acute, Cuden, negra así, Sudin, negro así, ag, hal, kohal, and so on. Negro de Guinea, what Guinea? Which Guyana, Guinea? Negro un poco, a little black. Camri, Camrin. Loro entre blanco y negro. Loro between white and black equals Camri, Camrlin. Loro que tira a negro, a loro which leans towards black. A loro, a dark-skinned person that leans towards black. Borgosio, Borgosin. So these are their terms, these so-called Arab, Castilian terms. The above are not the only colored terms used for people in Arabic, as for example, there is an expression, the black and the red, which is said to mean all mankind. Al-Amar, the red, and Al-Aswad, the black. Amar means red, red colored, ruddy, rosy, and pink. Another color moving in a darker direction is Kamri, translated above as Loro and a little black, but rendered elsewhere as golden brown. Golden brown, reddish brown, bronze colored, actually wine colored, from a root meaning to ferment. This term is also said by an Egyptian informant to refer to the common skin color of modern Egyptians, meaning light black, and being a favorable skin color. The The next term is asmar, meaning less than black, or in modern times, a polite way, a more favorable way of referring to very dark persons who might otherwise be called black. Asmar, call me Asmar, don't call me black, he's saying. That's what they were saying. There are several words for black, dark, and such terms, but the one often used for black Africans, aside from Asmar, is Aswad. Modern Arabic dictionaries use Ahmar for the red and red Indian. In any case, one can see that Arabic has had terms corresponding to Castilian, Negro, and Loro, but in addition has had Asmar, meaning probably Loro, Casi Negro, like almost black, and Ahmar, red, for Rufo. These are in addition to Abiyad, for white, and relative color terms, dark, and so on. Thus, it would appear that Arabic may be one of the richer of the modern Mediterranean languages in color terminology as applied to human beings. As will be indicated, the Romance-speaking areas by the 1200s and 1400s were using a number of terms to refer to intermediate human colors, such as olivegno, like olive color, right? Louro, pardo, remember pardo, Juan Pardo, huh? I told you that means brown. That's usually applied to brown-skinned people that were carrying that, especially in colonial times. Berretino, Rufo, and others. These are all color terms, right? They're describing people. Farther north in the Netherlands and elsewhere, there seems to have been few such terms. As interesting feature of this lack is the failure of Bruin or Bruni, brown, right? Bruin, just like the Boston Bruins, huh? The Browns, huh? Yeah, the Bruni, the Brun, so-called black, to develop as common terms, resort being had almost always to white or black, or more rarely to some relative concept such as dunker or darker, darker, donker, darker. On occasion, yellow was also used to describe brownish persons. Are you guys hearing? By the Dutch in the 17th century. Ludwig Wittgenstein asked, why don't we speak a pure brown? Is the reason merely the position of brown with respect to the other pure colors, its relationship to them all? Also, brown contains black. How would a person have to behave for us to say of him that he knows a pure primary brown? What does brown contains black mean? There are more and less blackish browns. Is there one which isn't blackish at all? There certainly isn't one that isn't yellowish at all. Dark and blackish are not the same concept. Why is it that a dark yellow doesn't have to be perceived as blackish, even if we call it dark? Darkness is not called a color. In paintings, darkness can also be depicted as black. The perception of color is a complex subject. The complexity stemming both from fundamental physical and perceptual issues and from social cultural training or conditioning, as Joseph Albers has said. All right, guys, pay attention. This is kind of deep, some of this stuff, you know. We shouldn't be going by color to classify people, but as Joseph Albers as said, as he's quoting, it says, in visual perception, color is almost never seen as it really is, as it physically is. In order to use color effectively, it is necessary to recognize that color deceives continually. It should be learned that one and the same color evokes innumerable readings. If one says red, and there are 50 people listening, it can be expected that there will be 50 reds in their minds, and one can be sure that all these reds will be very different. Every day, language seems to deal with color in a very imprecise and often symbolical manner. White is, of course, a good example, since probably a few, if any, human beings are white. That is, white is a blank color with, one could say, no color at all. It is significant that in recent centuries, white people have coined the expression colored people to refer to non-whites, thus stating English blank simply meant white. English blank, huh? But the fact remains that people called white are perhaps never white. All right? White is also a crayon color. Nobody's really white. They never white. They may be pinkish, light grayish, creamy, very light brown, ruddy, reddish, and so on, but not truly white. Thus, white as applied to humans is usually symbolic or non-specific. It meant something else. Black can also be seen as a symbolic or non-specific color, since few, if any, humans are actually black. All right? That's a crayon color too. The contrast between white and black must have been enhanced by the use of parchment, blank, with ink, black, for writing, as well as by other contrasts occurring naturally. But the application of the term white to humans must have arisen from contrast with people who were of darker color, and doubtless arose as a very gross, non-specific differentiation. The use of white as a referent for most Europeans must have arisen from a poverty of more precise off-white, color terms of a disinterest and fine distinctions. But the problems of color classification may actually extend to a deeper level of analysis. Ludwig Wittgenstein has commented that in everyday life we are virtually surrounded by impure colors, all the more remarkable that we have formed the concept of pure colors. We must always bear in mind the question, how do people learn the meaning of color names? And indeed, the pure colors do not even have special commonly used names. That's how unimportant they are to us. The logic of the concept of color is just more complicated than it might seem. Not all color concepts are logically of the same kind. The concept of color must be related to problems of perception. So continuing with Ludwig, he says, the color concepts are to be treated like the concepts of sensations. In my room, I am surrounded by objects of different colors. The place is whitish because the light wall makes the brown table lighter here. At any rate, it is much lighter than the rest of the table, but given a number of color samples, I wouldn't be able to pick out one which had the same coloration as this area of the table. Therefore, from the fact that this table seems brown to everyone, it does not follow that it is brown. But just what does it mean to say, this table isn't really brown after all? So does it then follow from its appearing brown to us, that it is brown? There is an indefiniteness about colors. Ludwig continues, he says, the colors are not things that have definite properties, so that one could straight off look for or imagine colors that we don't yet know, or imagine someone who knows different ones than we do. Continues, as in fact, it is probably true that the greater number of colors, shades, as seen by the eye, and especially shades of skin, have no names. The meaningless term flesh, meat, colored sometimes being used with obvious inaccuracy. One problem is that colors as pigments, dyes, separately, do not at all resemble skin colors, and when mixed they only serve to approximate to such colors. More importantly, what are the names for the newly created mixed colors? Let us imagine that someone were to paint nature, and in its natural colors, every bit of the surface of such a painting has a definite color. What color? How do I determine its name? Anyone who takes the time to carefully look at another human being or at one's own body will immediately be struck by the fact that there is no single color at all. This is true even in relatively even spread light. But what is also noticeable is that the effect of lighting radically changes the perception of color. In short, most or all human beings are of uneven or mixed color to begin with, and their color changes with changes in light at different times of day, whether inside or outdoors, and in relation to clothing and surroundings. Exposure to the sun also, of course, often results in tanning, that is, darkening, This problem of perception is compounded by the fact that human colors move from the light cream tones of some Europeans to the near black tones of some Africans and others. All right, again, that's the hijacks with how they're saying, oh, it's the Africans that are the darkest. Well, we know that out of Africa stuff has been debunked, but all right, just, pull out the babies, that's the hijacks. And an unbroken progression providing no clear marking points for guiding us as to when to switch from gross white to gross brown and so on. This unbroken stream of color conforms to no known series of colored terms, simply because such would require an infinity of terms which remain uninvented. Moreover, the stream actually seems to this writer to possess several currents dependent upon whether, for example, a yellow seems to underlay a brown or brown-black, or whether a reddish tone seems to come through the brown or brown-black, or whether it is a gray undertone or overlay, and so on. It is not always possible to compare, for example, the relative lightness or darkness of a particular brown-skinned person because of the indefinably mixed character of the color shades. Imitative pictures may be created, but they also have to be arbitrarily arranged and lack names. Whether in fact numerical values on a scale can be accurately assigned to such colors is a subject I won't go into here, except to note that it has no practical relationship to the naming of such shades by humans in any case. How subjective is the perception of color? How culturally determined is the perception of color? Ralph Hattersley describes a phenomenon of sleeping eyes called gray adaptation. And he says scientists describes it as the habit of seeing a given gray thing as gray, no matter what color the light source used for viewing it. Gray adaptation also refers to the habit of seeing hues, especially gray ones, as more gray or achromatic than they actually are. That is, our brains dechromatize hues, pushing them toward neutral. It would seem that cultural factors might encourage a similar tendency to fail to recognize shades of brown, off-white to brown-black. Yeah, cultural factors definitely make people biased. In short, a process of white adaptation and a black adaptation may be characteristic of cultures which were or are lazy in distinguishing browns. In this connection, it is worth noting that pardo, used for brownish shades in Portuguese and Spanish, right? That's what I was trying to tell you. These pardos were black folks, like John Pardo, conquistador. Used for brownish shades in Portuguese and Spanish, also was used for the gray color of wool. Hattersley notes further that the majority of Western, and quote the question mark, people have eyes that are barely awake to color. A modest number are, however, halfway awake. So he says they see hues even in colors that are assumed to have no hues, that is, in the blacks, grays, and whites. And they rarely see that a given dark brown color may actually be a low value yellow, orange, red, or magenta. It's funny how they're talking about people, right, as crayons right here. This is what they're trying to point out, guys. Such variations could also be cultural, that is, influenced by the perceptual descriptive habits of a particular people. In this connection, also, Joseph Albers has shown that even some art students cannot successfully distinguish lighter and darker light intensity without practice. Only a minority can distinguish the lighter from the darker within close intervals when obscured by contrasting hues or by different color intensities. Color is extremely important to us because it gives visual shape and size to all phenomena. Colorless objects are invisible to us, as anyone can affirm who has ever tried to walk through a spotlessly clean, clear glass door. To be colored, to have color, is to be visible. All right, you heard that? But what indeed is color? It is a sensation similar to hot and cold, sweet and sour, hard and soft, and so on. Is it the same? Some would say that we do not see colored objects since we do not look out from our eyes upon objects at a distance. On the contrary, according to one level of analysis, reflected light from the object is presumed to somehow stimulate our eyes and connected nerves to send the brain or mind a message about the object, not the object itself. In the mind, in some manner, the message is decoded and transformed into a colored, presumed representation of the object. It is the representation in the mind which is colored, not the object itself. Wow. Since our minds have no direct contact with the object, we cannot say that color is a characteristic which is inherent in the object. Instead, it is a characteristic of viewing the object, an act occurring as a part of a physical transaction with the mind. By means of color, we experience visibility, differentiation, spacing, and forming as a mental function. Of course, one problem with this type of analysis is that it fails to deal with the question of what is left of an object after color is removed. Or to put it differently, this type of dualistic analysis separates, artificially, I would think, the mind's seeing from the presumed objective world outside the mind. Such a view cannot be sustained in all probability, since the various pieces of the transaction between mind and object are all equally perceived in the mind and nowhere else known to us. That is, the eye, the optic nerves, the nervous system, the brain, the light waves, and light itself, including heat, are all perceptions in the mind of a perceiver, no matter what instruments are being utilized to objectively measure or examine the phenomena involved, since these measurements are only known when perceived in the mind or in computer programmed by a mind. And the instruments are, of course, also perceived in the mind. But however we analyze the perception of color, we find that it is an extremely complex interaction which cannot be separated from habits of the mind, which may be labeled as cultural, social, or individual opinions. Hattersley argues that the grouping or categorization of visual impressions is vital to our survival, and that we tend to frequently lump together things which should be seen as only being loosely related. So he continues saying, Hattersley says, so the tendency is to form categories, groups, or gestalts, and put things into them that don't really belong. There is a strange psychological law that we follow in this respect. Things that are alike in some ways are actually alike in all ways until it is proved otherwise. The law of similarity is strongest with respect to things we ordinarily pay little attention to. Continues, says this helps to explain why certain language groups tend to lump all dark brown peoples into a black category. All right? Now everybody's just black. Now everybody's just a crayon color, huh? All these dark brown people are just all shades of brown people. The process of lumping may also be facilitated by a cultural focus upon non-skin color characteristics, such as dark hair or woolly hair, which are used to trigger the use of a skin color category, even when it may not be appropriate. In this situation, indeed, black may not refer to skin color primarily, but to something more complex, all right? It's not about just skin color. In any case, the colors which we see individual then, he's asking, are these individual then? Do we all see the same colors? These questions cannot be fully answered, although color blindness indicates that we do not all see the same colors. Probably we learn within a particular culture or language to call something black or red. If I call X red and someone else calls Y red, it may not matter if X and Y are functionally related to the same object. In other words, we would not see the same color, but we would communicate because we use the word red in connection with the same object. A problem arises, however, when North American and British so-called whites or Europeans want to call Native Americans Redskins or Red Indians or Red people, while Latin Americans often see Americans as copper-colored. You see that? We say copper-colored, bronze-colored, or even Indio-colored. Oh, copper color. Yeah, we just mean, Indian color, Indian red, you get it. Also, Native Americans are perceived as being red, while Mexicans, Chicanos are not perceived as being red by white North Americans. The latter are more often called brown. These differentiations can have important political and social implications, as also when brown people in the West Indies are called black by outside writers. But but my examples may reflect culturally determined subjectivity. I nonetheless use them to illustrate the consequences at the practical level of perceptually determined subjectivity, since it may be that Native Americans look red to some white North Americans, while looking brown or copperish to others. It may be that there were people, as from Northern Europe, who did not see some browns but only saw a blackish color. They may actually have been unable to differentiate between shadings of brown. Thus, all darker brown peoples become black to them. Perhaps this is a genetically induced tendency, or perhaps a culturally determined one. Prejudice, yeah, or one where the effect is brought about by a combination of defective color discrimination and cultural disuse. In any case, we cannot know what colors are actually perceived by individuals, nor can we say precisely how biology and culture influence what colors are created in the mind, or which ones are emphasized at the expense of others. The practical problem is that we cannot know what a Spaniard of 1560, that's a very good observation, a Spaniard of 1560, not a one of 2024 or 2025. He might have looked different too. This Spaniard could have been so-called black too, or brown, or pardo, as they're saying here, copper colored. So we cannot know what a Spaniard of 1560 meant by stewed quince color, or what an Italian of 1530 meant by olive-ish color. Nor can we know if there was any agreement among people about such terms, or more importantly, about the colors in the mind conjured up by such terms. This issue of subjectivity is very relevant to modern radical terms used in most Latin American countries, and especially Brazil. This will be discussed below. At this point, it is best to focus upon earlier periods. It seems quite likely that most Christian Europeans of the late medieval period paid relatively little attention to human skin color. Again, they're talking about the Middle Ages, medieval times, because maybe most of the people were melanated, especially in Europe. That's why they paid little attention to human skin color. You see what they're letting you know? It's something more after the 1500s, except as an aid in the identification of a fugitive or as one of several ways to describe an individual. Human beings were still understood to be all descended from Adam and Eve, right? Adam means red or colored. Huh? Thus, all human beings in the biblical tradition were of the same race or stock. Some had become tanned or burned by the sun of the equatorial zone, but the various were not of fundamental significance. Most slaves and serfs were white. Most slaves and serfs were white, and of the same color at birth as were the ruling classes. You guys hear that? As we shall see, it has been noted earlier, concern was directed toward developing a very few terms to describe people of intermediate color between black and white. There was apparently no concern or need to identify persons of mixed race, since the concept of race, as we know it, did not exist. All right, it didn't exist back then as we know it today after the 1800s, guys. This is what I've been trying to tell you. Concepts made up in the 1800s. These people didn't have these concepts, right? But they had other concepts. So the concept of race as we know it did not exist, and race mixture among humans was not an existent concept. Continuing, it says here the evolution of hybrid and the concept of racial mixture. All right, this is pretty deep stuff right here, guys. The condition of, literally like spreading prejudice and stereotypes around, like the creation of this is the word hybrida. It's interesting in this connection. The term apparently originated in Roman times to refer to the progeny of a tame sow and a wild boar, also called semífero, half wild. This meaning persisted for a long time, being used in English texts in 1601 and 1623 for a half-wild hogs. Pliny is quoted as referring to mixture with wild in connection with the concept. The term also came to be applied to one born of a Roman father and a foreign mother, or a freeman and a slave. You guys hear that? So you see the different ways it was being used, right? Not about color when it comes about freeman or slave, or a Roman father and a foreign mother. It has nothing to do with color. Antonio de Nebrija, in his dictionary, Spanish Latin of 1492 states, Hibrida por hijo de fiero y manso. Hybris, hijo de peregrino y ciudadano. Hybris. That is a progeny of a tame and wild parent and of a traveler, foreigner, and a citizen. You see what that meant? A hybrid meant somebody who was from the exterior and someone who was considered wild. Wow, that's a hybrid. That's what it meant back then. A new concept was recorded by Jerónimo Cardoso in his Portuguese Latin dictionary, prepared before 1569, when he stated, por mestizo equals lat or hibria. Portuguese and mulatto probably, mulatto equals lat hibrida, lat hibrida e homeno mulatto. Thus, the concepts of mestizo and mulatto in Portuguese were being equated with Latin hibrida. Mulatto was also defined as a mule and as the progeny of a male donkey and a mare. The 1643 edition of Cardoso is the same, except that mestizo equals hibria has been corrected to mestizo equals hibris or hibrida. The Nebrija Latin Spanish Dictionary of 1554 and 61 notes that hibridas in Pliny was an old term for a semífero hog, and also that by extension it could be applied to homines, semiferi, half-wild people. And further, possunt appellari, right, that says a name for troublesome nations. Agostinho Barbosa's Portuguese Latin Dictionary from 1611 equated mestizo with hibris or hibridis, but not referred to the term mulatto. Bento Pereira, in his Portuguese Latin Dictionary of 1646, states the following. So he says mulatto equals lat hibrida, and this is what he got, right? Mestizo hibris, hibrida, hibris eso. Okay. Thus, a mestizo dog or pig and mulatto are equated with hibrida, and the latter is also defined, among other things, as a child of adultery, as the mulatto, mule or human, question, or as the child of a native and a stranger. You see? A native and a stranger, mulatto. A native and a stranger. It's not about color, not about white and a black African mixing. Sometimes it just meant a child of an indigenous person and a foreigner, or two people from different nations. Emmanuel Pina Cabral's 1780 Latin Portuguese lexicon quotes Pliny to the effect that hibrida refers to an animal born of two diverse species, and Horace to the effect that a hybrid is o filho de pai e mãe de países. All right, so that is a child of parents from different countries or conditions. That's what a mestizo or mulatto is, a child of parents from different countries or conditions or nations, guys. It wasn't about color. What I've been trying to tell you. The 1802 edition maintains the same meanings. The 1778-90 editions of Nebrija add some new informations. So this is the definitions on that dictionaries. Okay. It says, thus hibrida is still equated with a dog of two castes, crossbreeds, and a pig born of a wild and tame parent. But to this has been added new items were indicated by an asterisk, the concept that mulatto equals only a hybrid Ethiopian, while mestizo equals an American-Spanish mixed blood and an animal born of two species. The significance of these changes for our understanding of the terms mulatto and mestizo will be discussed later. At this point, it is my intention to call attention only to the fact that hybridity for a long period of time was associated with non-racial intermixture. Okay? Listen, that is, with the mixture of tame and wild, of citizen and foreigner, and so on. It wasn't about race or color. Because it could have been two people of the same so-called race or color. One was a citizen, one was a foreigner, one was a native, one was a colonist. This concept of mixture is, I believe, very significant for our analysis of the terms used for intermediate colored people, for instance, Loro and Pardo, because these terms did not imply interracial mixture, nor did they, in fact, make any assertion about ancestry. Okay? Very important. They don't imply anything to do with interracial mixture or ancestry. Can't go off of the color alone to determine these people's ancestry. It seems that the mixture of native and foreigner, of tame and wild, was of some significance, but the concept that racial differences, in the modern sense, were more important than other differences, nationality, religion, being a stranger, did not apparently exist. Okay? So this is big right here, guys. Just to remember that. The context, time periods, and how people thought and everything, what people really look like that you are picturing. Continuing in the book says the classification of peoples and the rise of racialism. Consequently, we must always keep in mind that the terms for brownish peoples to be discussed below arose in a climate of non-racialism, indifference to races, and a period in which emphasis was placed upon appearance as opposed to racial genealogy. All right, only to appearance and not the actual genealogy. Pay attention, some modern authors have attempted to equate terms such as Loro with the latter term mulatto, and by both to mean mixed racially. But as we shall see, such interpretations are a reading back into the medieval and early modern periods of much more recent ideas. All right, these are recent ideas. This is, in fact, one of the greatest obstacles to understanding intergroup relations in the early modern period. The mistake of interpreting the terminology in terms of modern concepts of race. All right, you can't use your modern concepts of race to try to figure out what these writings from the colonial times were saying when they were saying mulatto, loro, black, brown, right, and even white, black, and of the importance of ancestry or descent. Problems arise when people of black color, in parentheses, are put in a category labeled the Negro race, or when of people of Loro color are called mulattoes with a modern meaning, or when Pardos are called people of African descent, and so on. Pardos are so-called black, Pardo, like Juan Pardo, the conquistador. Before analyzing in detail the terms Loro and Pardo, it is necessary to say a few words about how people seem to have been classified and or categorized in the 1200s and 1400s in the Mediterranean region. Slaves seem to have been classified according to their ethnic or national names. For example, Russians, Turks, Greeks, Tartars, Circassians. People might be also categorized according to broader groupings, often with a religious meaning, such as Saracens, Jews, Christians, Mixtiarabis, Mozarabis, that is, Christians in Spain with an Arabic style of culture. Crypto Jews, you mean? Tagares, Muslims of the Toledo area living under Christian rule, again, cryptos, and so on. Color terms were also used to describe many slaves, but not all. And the terms include white, black, loro, rufo, and oliveño. These terms were applied to individuals as already discussed. In addition, some populations of uniform color, such as the Berbers or southern Mauritania, might be called Beritini as a group. No association of color with servitude existed. Okay? It wasn't about color. Just because you're black, you means you're a slave, or white, you means you're free. No association of color with servitude existed, since most slaves were European or North African. Most slaves were what? Europeans. On the other hand, a predominance of a certain type of slave may have resulted in their ethnic or class name becoming almost synonymous with slave. For instance, Saraceni, Moro, Slavi or Slavi, Slavi, Slavs, slave, depending on the period. Servi, like Serbian or servant, right? And captivi were the most common non ethnic terms used for captives and slaves. Religious barriers seem to have been the most important for intermarriage. Evidence from the 16th century provides numerous examples of white Spaniards, for example, marrying or cohabiting with slaves of various colors or freeing their mixed children, so called white, European legal status. No legal barriers existed, and non whites seem to have been rapidly absorbed into the population. Non whites, like non white Spaniards, too. Prejudice did exist, but it does not seem to have formed part of an exclusionary racialist system. During the 1500s and later, concern developed in Spain and Portugal about descent, but primarily as regards descent from forcibly converted Jews or Muslims, right? The crypto Moranos and Moriscos, right? That's when it became becoming racial with them. Remember, the black codes is all about them. Later, this concern about religious ancestry and the possibility of secret non-Christian practices that comes from them seems to have become attached to non-white ancestry. But the evolution of ancestry-based discriminatory practices is complex and requires separate analysis. In any case, the latter practices arose primarily in the colonies. In the 16th century, new terms for brown people and mixed bloods developed. The slave population was still ethnically very heterogeneous, but so-called black Africans, right? They're saying, or just in general slaves. Other slaves formed a higher percentage than in previous times. People continue to be described primarily in non-racial terms. For example, in Brazil, one finds the Americans being identified sometimes by village names and more often by national names such as Tupi, Namba. These are your slaves. Listen, Tamoyo or Carijo, Indian slaves. In addition, geographical or regional designations were employed, such as Brazilians, for the Tupi-speaking nationalities and Tapuyas for non-Tupi-speaking groups. Still broader geographical names were also employed, such as Indio for people from Indias, the Americas. And it says dark-skinned people that had Negroid appearances and were considered Negro were identified as Negros de Guinea or Escravos from Guinea, from Guyana. In addition, Americans were sometimes called Negros, as noted previously. Okay, in addition, what? Americans were called. So who's the Negroes? This is what I was just saying. As noted previously, a term which seems to have sometimes denoted non-whites in general. The Portuguese were called Christians and brancos, whites, while Americans were referred to as gentiles, pagans, if unconverted. After about 1552, one also finds the terms Mamaluco and Mestizo being used for mixed bloods, although on occasion, half European mixed bloods were also called brancos, whites. Occasionally, also Americans were identified by color as being pardo, vaco, or darkish, or preto, or black. All right, so this is what I'm saying. What Africans, who's identifying the Negroes? Let me see the primary sources. Because Americans were being identified as black folks too. Preto, Negro, black. But these terms were not yet used in any caste-like sense. In the Iberian Peninsula, and even more in the Americas, color terms multiplied. In the 16th and 17th centuries, our concern here relates primarily to certain early terms, which later proved to be insufficient because, in all probability, of the complex process of miscegenation. These early terms, Loro, Pardo, were supplemented by a great variety of terms which so perplexed later writers that they began to devise ways to organize, define, and classify both the terms and the people they referred to. This process of classification, which became in fact genealogical or racial, seems to have resulted from a rationalistic, scientific, in parentheses, desire to bring a sense of order and logic into what appears to this author to have been an ad hoc, disorderly world of subjective descriptions of color and other phenotypical characteristics. To some extent, of course, Spanish and Portuguese authorities desired a degree of terminological order, since colonial statutory law sometimes differentiated between persons who were European or white, right, or just European, right, mixed and Native American. Phenotypical characteristics. This is what I'm saying about just classifying people as African that are so-called black. Phenotypical characteristics and prejudices and stereotypes. On the other hand, most classification systems went beyond the strict needs of Iberian law in order to offer a rational structure for fine gradations of phenotypical descriptors, which had no immediate relevance for legal status. In 1735, Carl Linnaeus published the first edition of his System of Nature. Living creatures were thereby logically arranged by genus, species, and variety. Human beings were divided into two species, Homo sapiens and Homo monstrous. Within Homo sapiens were placed wild men, Americans copper colorless, and Europeans fair, Asians sooty, and 5 Africans black. Right? So that's the hijack with these. This is what I'm saying. They start creating these like, oh, these will be all your blacks, your Africans. So what about all the blacks in America that were, in 1735? So Homo monstrans included Patagonians and flat-headed Canadians, both American groups, as well as Hottentots and Chinese. Linnaeus was followed by other writers who attempted to organize human beings in various classification systems. All this is all hijacked, trying to classify people like this. Quite naturally, one aspect of this effort was to logically arrange the various kinds of physical types resulting from miscegenation into equally logical systems. A plethora of lists of racial terms resulted being especially common in the 19th century for the Caribbean colonies, Dutch, English, French, and for the Spanish colonies somewhat earlier. An example of such an effort is the work of Joseph Gumilla, published in 1745 and relating to the Venezuelan region. First, Gumilla noted that some Indios Americanos were almost whites, that others were trigueños, wheat brown, and still others were prietos y morenos, black and darkish. Variety in Venezuela with its indigenous people. We've gotten these descriptions before. Yes, America's the true old world, guys. It wasn't just one shade. Copper colored tribes, right? Many shades of copper, from the lightest copper to the darkest so-called black, right? Morenos, pretos, there was pretos too. There was morenos too, so-called black Indians. But that in general, they were de color trigueño, they were brown. Ya más, ya menos pardos, and leaning to black. That is of wheat color, now more or less the part or darkish brown, wheat or brown, right? Trigueños, wheat brown. The mixture of Americans with Europeans produced the following line of ascent. So this is according to their classification in the 1700s, right? Because to leave the American race was to improve one's grade. One, the Europeo India, you get a mestiza. Then from a European to a mestiza, you get a quarterone. Then from a European to a quarterone, you get a octavone and so on, like octoroons and stuff, Gumilla also knows that Pope Clement XI declared that both the quartetones and the octavones were to be classed as blancos. Hey, even if they're mixed, let's make them white. He also states que de por fixo que por los mismos grados por donde blanquea la mestiza, blanquea también la mulata. So thus it was established that the same 4 grades also applied to European And I didn't say nothing about African right there, guys. African mixtures as follows. So the European negra sale mulata and so on, right? So again, remember, all Europeans weren't pale skin. These are just classifications, not even based on colors, guys. They're talking about the mixtures between different nations, classification of mixtures of between nations, not of color. It seems very questionable whether this so very neat system actually ever had any reality. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Aside from its appealing symmetry, one knows that Cuarterona, Ochavona, and Puchuela are used for both American, European, and African European mixed bloods, for everybody basically, an unlikely occurrence, especially in the face of many other alternative terms. Moreover, a few pages later, Comilla himself has resort to Negro, Astesado, Mulata Blanca, and Mestiza Blanca, terms not found in his charts. Many of the elaborate charts and paintings developed in the Spanish Empire to describe improperly placed mixed persons derived no doubt from a desire to clarify the racial caste systems which had evolved in the colonies. But the influence of Linnaean rationalism must also have been a factor. So this guy's influence is what he's saying. In any case, systems developed some 200 or more years after the commencement of miscegenation must inevitably be extremely flawed, since an individual might well look black but possess American or European ancestry. You see what I'm saying? You look so-called black. What does that mean? Negroid? You're talking about Negroid? Or what you perceive as being Negroid associated to West Africans? But he's American. Actually, he's European too, because both these places had so-called black people originally. You see? So we gotta, this book was written back in the 90s or 80s, so we add our new learning to this, right? As we're reading along today and reviewing this. So that's big one right there. He may look black, but he's actually American. Yeah, he's an Indian. His people were Indians or like Europeans. Black but possess American or European ancestry. Might look white but possess American or African ancestry. Might look white. He's passing for white because he has some so-called black in him, not African. Or might look Indian and yet be part so-called black or part European. See, this is what I'm saying. So they're using African as black and European as white. So we got to dodge the hijacks. They might be mixed. In the end, they might be mixed. They might be called white or black. They might be mixed. The classification systems assume that in, let us say, 1745, if one who is an Indian marries Dorotea, who is white, then the child subsequently born will be a mestizo, that is, white and American. In fact, however, one may be Indian only by appearance, and Dorotea may have African ancestry, you see, or be so-called black. That's what they're saying. So we dodge the hijack every time we see the African, right? The child then may have the appearance of mulatto of some type and may be classified in practice according to that appearance, in some circles, or according to the appearance of the parents, among those who know them, and so on. The idea that the mixture of white and Americans produces a mestizo. What white? See, they're calling all Europeans white, guys. See what I'm saying? That's the hijack. So European and Indian produces a mestizo or mulatto, right? Common assertion of Spanish charts is, in fact, a false assertion, since some such persons will be totally American in appearance and will be called and treated as an Indian, while some others will appear fair or light and will be treated as either a blanco or some sort of near white. You see that? Or look, you're more European, like its European parent, and be treated more European. This illustration brings to the fore the fundamental flaw in such rational systems derived from a cultural ideological battle between appearance and the description of appearance and ancestry, the genealogy of the parents, where terms such as lobo, coyote, mulatto, primarily based upon a perception of appearance, or were they based upon an inquiry into or exact knowledge of ancestry? Were they? The record that we have which assign a color or caste term to an individual are usually based upon self-description or perhaps more commonly the perception of the individual by a public official, such as a census taker or a police authority. See, now it's based on the census taker. We see these differences in the senses of your people, right? You find it, and you're like, oh, 10 years they're labeled black, then another 10 years they're white, then they're mulatto. What's going on here? Because it was the perception of the census taker, whatever she thought he was. This is what I'm saying. I've been telling you that for a while. So, perception of the individual, commonly taken the information, or public official, right? Like a police authority or a notary describing a runaway slave. It is to be suspected that the parents were never present to be observed, except sometimes in the case of young children. Moreover, the purpose usually was to describe and identify the individual. It would perhaps have been foolish to use a statement about ancestry when very often the appearance of the individual would require a different term or sets of terms. In any case, there is considerable evidence that in Latin influenced cultures, racial terms are used only for the individual's appearance, including perhaps the perception of status, perception, as an attribute of appearance, and not as a statement about race or ancestry. That's deep right there, guys. Remember this part right here. For example, the Marvin Harris studied the application of racial terms in modern Brazil. He found that in addition to the plethora of racial terms, he says, in Brazil, racial identity involves a much more complicated set of calculations than in the United States. I am now of the opinion that we shall never be able to state the general cognitive formula by which particular Brazilians assign a racial identity to themselves, or by which particular Brazilians are assigned a racial identity by others. That's what he said. The absence of a descent rule or descent rule was one of the features noted by observers prior to Harris, but the latter, by conducting tests in the Bahia region, confirmed that a rule of descent was indeed absent from the calculation of racial identity. Harris found that not only were siblings with the same parents, listen, siblings with the same parents assigned different descriptors, brothers and sisters, guys, being, classified as black or white, like with the same parents, right? That happens in the States, a lot of siblings look different. Okay, so same parents assign different descriptors according to their appearance, but that there was very little agreement as to what descriptors to apply. Moreover, when respondents were asked to describe the abstract qualities designated by a particular term, they were frequently found to be in substantial disagreement. A final note of confusion resulted when spot checking on some of the tests indicated a high probability that a given informant might reverse his position when approached after an interval of a couple of weeks. Harris suggests that racial terms may mean different things to different people. The use of racial terms appears to vary from individual to individual, from place to place, time to time, test to test, observer to observer. All right, it be changing according to people's, cultural background or belief system perspectives. In short, individualism characterizes the use of color, racial terms in much the same way as individualism surrounds the use of concepts such as sweet and sour, hard and soft. As Wittgenstein noted, we must treat color concepts somewhat like sensations. Perhaps it has always been foolish for writers or officials to attempt to falsely objectify or organize an inherently individual process. It is interesting in this connection to note that sometimes naive efforts to divide humankind up into 2, 3, 4, 5 or more races and to transform race from a very loose term meaning kind or stock or breed, listen, into a precise genetic-based scientific term have been themselves a form of, and indeed an extremely important part of modern racialism. It creates racialism. You're trying to categorize billions of people in the world into a couple of groups. It makes no sense. The same process has led to the concept of a number of biologically separate races, then resulted in a desire to chart out what might happen when persons derived from these so-called biological groupings intermix with each other. Unfortunately, for any kind of accuracy, such efforts came several hundred years too late, if not indeed thousands of years too late. In any case, let us now turn to look at the way in which such important terms as mulatto and mestizo came into being, beginning with an analysis of their predecessor terms, loro, pardo, and so on, okay? Before mulatto and mestizo, guys, there was these other terms. And it says here, the use of the term loro. The term loro, its various forms, is recorded as early as 930 as a color description for certain cattle, vaca laura. In 1215, a poem has many chestnut oxen, so the chestnut color, right? Brown. Others dusky and loro. Muchos bueyes, castaños, otros focos de loros, the latter to rhyme with toros. For many centuries, loro continued to be used as a color term for animals of various shades, typically ranging from the reds through browns, but obscure dark, okay, or multicolored character. In the Mozarabic Romance language of Spain, it pointed towards morena que tira a negro, or dark-skinned person going into so-called black. That makes no sense. It's all the same, right? Y también amarillo, and also yellow y rubio and blonde aplicado al trigo to the dark complexion. That is a dark color inclined towards black, and also yellow and blonde as applied to wheat. But it is clear, as Corominias points out, that loro was usually applied to darker shades. In general, dark-skinned people that you would be classified as black today. Even the word loro, guys. Darker shades, but with great shifts of meaning because of the infinite variations in color exhibited by cattle and other animals. By 1246, Loros was being applied to slaves in Barcelona. In the 1200s, listen, between 1243 and 1296, about 18% of the 50 slaves recorded in one source for Barcelona were Laura or Loros. All right, so who are these slaves? We're talking about the 1200s, guys. This has nothing to do with the colonization of America, right? So I thought the Moors were enslaving so-called whites, right? Or the Slavs who were supposed to be white. So who are these slaves that are actually dark shades of color, dark complexion people? Loros, they're being described as Loros. They all were Saracen or Muslim. They're saying these slaves were Muslim. Makes no sense. I thought Muslims ruled Spain and Portugal at the time. So who are these Muslim Saracen slaves? These are dark-skinned people, right? In 1283, the Saracen Asmet, categorized as Loros, was mentioned in Aragon. In Barcelona, some personal names of Larum and Lara, slaves, reveal Islamic origin. Maimonan and two people called Fatima. Occasionally, however, converts were made, as in Barcelona, when the Saracen neophyte Barbara, of 30-year age, was for sale with her daughter Margaret, the 14 months. The latter was called Lara. You guys see, so the name Lara actually goes back to being dark complexion, dark skin, dark colors, dark browns, dark reds. During the 15th century, Moro, right, or Moro, had replaced Saracen. So that replaced Saracen in Barcelona, but Jord or Loro slaves continued to be sold, as in 1428 and 1431, all were of the Nación de Moros, Jord, except for one Jordi, a Christian who might have been a Russian. In Genoa, Italy, a Laro slave was sold during this period, but Oliveño, olive, was a more common designation for such persons. In 1460, a Valencian poet, Jaume Roig, described the people to be seen there. He said, totes de a cualquier, so this is what he's saying. Thus, Loros were, so he's saying Negroes and Loros, Jews and Christians, Jews. Thus, Loros were enumerated along with Christians, Jews, Muslims, blacks, whites, and ruddy people as part of the Valencia population. You see all these people, a lot of them all dark reds, dark browns. The Islamic law and Christian ruled Spain during the early 15th century, apparently reflecting usage in Muslim-controlled Granada, possessed a section which stated that, and that's what it says, you see, a Muslim, that is, in a Muslim-controlled village, a newly converted Muslim could possess a Muslim slave provided that the latter was black or Loro and not white. Uh-oh, you see that? Wow. During the period of 1472 and 1521 in Seville, and 1482, 1516 in Valencia, the term Loro was the almost exclusive destination for slaves, not classified as either black or white. Huh. One ruddy Moro Bermejo, that's red, Bermejo is red, is listed for 1513. In Seville, the majority of Loros mentioned, registered or otherwise, had only a Christian name, and no place of birth was stated. Are these the Indians now? Are these the Indians? Many could have been born in Spain of Muslim parents who had been enslaved as a result of the war with Granada, while others could have been descendants of Muslims from North Africa, or they could have been American slaves. Guys, we know they were being sent over there. Franco Silva, who has published the records, feels that a good portion were children of Negroes and some were Muslims. A few he notes were Canarios and Americans, like I was just saying, American Indians. In any case, the majority of Loros cannot be identified ethnically since they are only their name and color is recorded. So again, they don't know. They're guessing that they're saying, oh, they must be from Africa because they're so-called black. Because when they're saying Americans, they're picturing what, when you Google Native American today, those images come up. You get what I'm saying? So again, this book, even though it has a lot of drop, we got to hijack a little bit and know the background, the context that we already know. Okay? So it says a few examples will be given here to illustrate the use of Loro in Seville. So in 1475, Fernando Loro, 17, from Seville, born 1458. Marian Lora, age 22, from Fez, Morocco. Look, Pastor, 13, Florida, Maranhão, Brazil, from Brazil. I told you they had in 1500s slaves from Brazil. All right? And so on, you guys see? All these people that's supposed to be from, even the ones that are Africa, right, supposedly, Catalina, right? They're all Loros. They're all being classified with the same color. Loro was dark shades, these are people that would be classified as black today, or supposedly have an African descendancy. Supposedly, right? Just because they're so-called black or dark complexion. So here's some more. In addition, there are these helpful references. Una esclava Lora Juana with her child Francisca. Okay. De color Loro, of color Loro, native of Jerez. Okay. And so on. You guys see the examples. You can slow it down. From these examples, one can see that the following are true. The children of female Loras are sometimes not classified, thus probably being white, probably, so-called. The children of several Negras are called Loras, thus implying a Loro or white father, or implying many Loras were of Islamic origin. Some Loras were of Indian, Calicut, and American ancestry. Several were from West Africa, from Portugal and the Azores, so what West Africa, like Cape Verde and all these islands. The fact that Juan de Valladolid, a Negro of distinguished background, was named as judge of the Negroes and Loros of Seville in 1475, as noted previously, implies some type of commonality among Negroes and Loros at that date, prior to the War of Granada, when many Spanish Muslims were enslaved. All right, again, a lot of context missing, right? You guys make sure that they turn the info. It may well be that the commonality derived from their converted Christian status and from their origin as slaves, although some were by then free. The integration of Loros into Seville society is illustrated by these examples. So here's an example, 1501, Andres Garcia, of the color of Loro, to go to Haiti. To go where? To Haiti. And he's a dark complexion. Is he a black European? Most likely, along with Cristobal Palacios, de color Loro, vecino de Trigueros. These are black Europeans going into Haiti, right here, letting you know. Una mujer Lora inherits a house from her son, all right, so and so on. And that says, thus we see the people of Loro color being vecino, resident, going to Haiti, inheriting a house, and learning a trade, who have Loro color, dark complexions. In Valencia, there were many Loros from 1480 onward. Examples which illustrate the use of the term are as follows. Okay, look at this from 1482, Musa, right? Like Mansa Musa, Moses, Musa, and Allah más negro que Lord. He's more black than a Loro. He ran away. He's actually more black than a Loro. That's what I'm saying, guys. So you see these examples of when they're using Laura. They're using Laura for black people. This is basically what I'm trying to let you know. Okay? Many examples that he's given. Of some 67 Loros in the registration list, almost half, 30, can be identified with certainly as Muslims from Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, or Tunisia. Black folks. Another 6 can definitely be identified as Spanish Muslims, while 7 were Canary people, and 3 were from India. Only 4 are known to be the mixed children of Negros and Blancos, while some 17 are of unknown origin, but in many cases appearing to be baptized ex-Muslims. Thus, it would appear that the majority of Loros were simply brownish skinned. Okay? Thus, it would appear that the majority of Loros were simply brownish skinned people, so called black people. They're saying from North Africa, Canary Islands, the Americas, or India. Okay? Americas are probably a bunch of them they're leaving out. This is what I'm saying, guys. We got the numbers, we got the history. We got the history. Okay? Loros are other types of black folk. Other black folks, there's certain shades that were declassifying brownish skinned people. A certain percentage were mixed bloods of recent origin, but it cannot be demonstrated that many Loros were of that type. One can see also that the term Loro, by being modified, could embrace many shades of skin color. The lightest shade cited above was probably Blanca Oscura, a dark, light-skinned person, dark white or dark white. And then the next would be Blanca Casi Lora or Lora Blanco or Más Blanco que Lora, followed by Loro, and then by various combinations of Loro and Negro. The records for the sale of slaves at Las Palmas in the Canary Islands begin in 1519, about the time the early published records for Seville and Valencia stopped. Thus, it is useful to view the Canary records as providing some insight into the transition period when other terms began to supplement and replace Loro. From 1519 through 1530, Loro is the only intermediate color term used. Of the 12 persons classified as Loro, 6 can definitely be identified as either Muslims from North Africa or as Spanish Muslims converted to Christianity. Moriscos, the others, are not identifiable. Between 1532 and 1599, another 32 Loros were registered, but they were greatly outnumbered after 1552 to 1554 by mulattoes. The different terms used for Loros are as follows, with date first used. All right, so here's some dates with the words being used. All right. It is not possible to state that the ethnic origins of most of the Loros after 1532, since almost all have Christian names. However, several are identified as being Morisco, all right, Moriscos, these are ex-Moors, right, Moriscos, or of North African origin, as are several mulattoes. It should be noted that one North African woman, 1557, is described as de color algo basa, of somewhat darkish colors. Basa is another way of saying swarthy in French, I think, of somewhat darkish color. While another woman is termed morena, morena, in 1563. In 1523, Fatima Blanca Berberisca is recorded with 2 Loro children. The term Loro, as noted above, is used after 1532 intermittently in the Canary Islands, as also in Valencia and elsewhere. Its decline will be discussed below, but first let us examine other data showing what kind of people were called Loro by Spaniards. First, it is useful to note that Loro, as well as other terms for non-whites, was not always used for the children of black women by white men. In 1525, Juanico, the son of Maria Negra, was said to be de color blanco. Other cases are also to be seen where such children were white in parentheses. Thus, Loro and Mulatto were not automatically applicable to the mixed bloods as such. Again, use your discernment, right, in the time periods. As we have seen from the records cited above, many kinds of people could be classed as Loro, including a Jew, right, because Sephardic Jews were dark complexion, Muslims from North Africa, Moors, right, Moors were also classified as Loro, Berbers from the Agadir region as well, Canary Island natives, the Indians of the Canary Islands, people from India, and look, Native Americans, right, Loros, dark complexion, brownish skin people. You guys understand what they're telling you here? You got to dodge the hijack with the terms they use for all these people and how they separate them. All of them might be related anciently. Either way, they're letting you know so-called black Indians. And the children of white and Negro parents. It's white and Negro, right? White, so-called white. Prey on color too. What white? As noted earlier, Las Casas stated that the ancient people of the Casiterides Islands, the Azores perhaps, were gente lora, or of a swarty color, or baza de color, swarty, dark complexion people. Dark complexion people, the natives of the Azores. It is especially interesting to note that the early Spaniards in the Caribbean regarded the American natives as being Loro color, okay? Body bag for the illusion. Now that we got the foundation of what Loro means, right? We just read the whole thing, right? Is that being applied to West Africans, is being applied to Moors, is being applied to dark skin, brownish, red, dark brown, dark red, colored people, Swarty people, so-called black people, Negro people. So it's telling you right here again, it is especially interesting to note that the early Spaniards in the Caribbean regarded the American natives as being of Loro color, okay, dark complexion people. Columbus noted on several occasions that the Americans were the color of the Canarios, all right? We already got that the Canarians were Loro, dark complexion, brown, reddish brown, dark brown, neither black nor white. In between, huh? Bernaldez, writing from Columbus data, stated that the Americans were de color loros, blancos más que negros. Yeah, right. Not all of them. White more than black, they're saying. What white? So there's a lot of different nations here, right? Different shades. In 1495, Jaime Ferrer wrote to Columbus that lo más que puede sentir them. Okay, let's see if we translate it. Yeah. That is, the Indians, Arabs, and Ethiopians indicated that the greater part of the good things, gold, etc., come from hot regions where the people are black or loro brown or loro, which means brown, brown complexion people. That's where all the good things and the gold comes from. That's why we got the true Gold Coast here in Central America and South America and the Caribbean. The true Gold Coast. Loro means brown. You guys get it? The Indians were brown. That's what the Columbus and the early Spanish were saying. Following up on the above usage, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain in 1499 and again in 1500 authorized the expeditions of Yañez, Pinzon, and Batidas to capture what? Listen, esclavos negros, or loros, or otros found in the Americas. What? To capture what? To capture what? Esclavos negros, black slaves. From where? Found in the Americas. Found in the Americas. You guys see that? Okay, found in the Americas. I'm going to highlight it for you if you don't see it. What did she say? Queen Ferdinand and Isabella, King Ferdinand and Isabella, go capture some black slaves or Loro slaves, brown skinned slaves that are found in the Americas. Go capture them. Okay, that's what the actual records say. They don't say go capture them from Africa. All right, this is the biggest details they be leaving out. Body bag for the illusion. Shout out to Drop, man. All right, got the footnote and everything. Number 26. The Spanish writer Fernández de Oviedo wrote that the people of this island, Puerto Rico, es Lora, brown complexion. We talking about the Taínos, Arawak, and that the people who lived in the Orinoco area son Loros, and even the people from the Orinoco, they have many shades of dark, very dark complexion, up to, very lighter dark complexions and copper colors, all over the Orinoco. He also referred to a servant as being de color loro. His servant was also dark complexion. This usage continued for some time prior to 1638. The poet Francisco de Quevedo, for example, made reference to all Indio Cisco, tapetado y loro. The use of tapetado, dark brown. Tapetado meant dark brown, okay? Just like you, dark brown. Perhaps indicates that loro was already archaic and used for purposes of rhyme. Most certainly, then loro did not mean mixed, nor can anyone reasonably equate the brown-skinned Berbers of North Africa, the American Indians or Native Americans, or the Canary Islanders with such a concept. Certain Spanish writers have attempted to regard Muslim loros as being the product of intermixture between black Africans and white North Africans, but the color of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years previously would have doubtless fallen within the loro range. All right, we're talking about copper colored. One cannot assume that brown-skinned peoples are hybrids, since in fact white and black peoples may have diverged from an original brown intermediate human stock, okay? An original, this is what we're talking about. If Adam means red, if Adam means literally Loro, Adam literally will fall under Loro, guys. Did you know that Adam and Eve, Adam means red, copper colored. Talking about dark red, all right? Ruddy dark red. So this is what I'm saying when they're trying to classify, oh, you're brown because probably their ancestors were black Negro folks and white people, so now they're brown. Now, come on now. He's trying to say that's debunked. They might be from an original brown intermediate human stock from creation. Antonio de Nebrija defined Loro as between blanco y negro, an equivalent to Latin fuscus, dark or dusky. Loro que tira negro, darkish Loro, was equated with luridus. John Michaud, 1599, defined Loro as dun-colored, also a parrot. Okay, now we're going to get into it. A parrot. I told you guys earlier that Loro to us now means parrots, like a bird, the parrot. And I'm going to show you who they always depict a parrot as, I'm going to remind you. And there's a reason, because the parrot means dark skin. By that date, the use of Loro for a type of parrot had appeared, okay? All of a sudden, Loro, they switched up the word, guys. They didn't want us to know, like the word Swarty, what it really meant back in the day. It meant dark-skinned people. And they were describing Europeans and American Indians as dark-skinned people, as Loros. And all of a sudden, now we use the word Loro to mean parrot. By 1617, Michaud stated for Loro, Fuscus, Latin dun, in English, dun, dark complexion, dun. We know that, right? Loro is dun. Also papagayo, parrot. In 1607, Caesar Odin stated Loro between white and black, Spanish, brown between black and white, obscure, blackish, dusky, inclined towards the black. Inclined towards the black, Loro. So is the so-called black, French, right? You see, it's just dark complexions, guys. This made Loro virtually the same as another entry for morena, cosa basa. Morena, something dark, all right? A morena that's sometimes dark. Okay, come on now, Loro. Indians are being described as Loro, right? Europeans are being described as Loro, right? Okay, you guys get it? Since the French equivalent was given as brun, noir, right, black, noir, nor negro, obscure, dark. In 1639-40, the Dutch equivalent was added to the above bruin. Bruin, we already know that's black. Zwartischheid, look, Zwartischheid, get blood, brown, blackish. Zwartischheid means blackish and bluish perhaps. Julio Cejador, in his work on medieval Castilian, says of Loro, obscure, yellowish, or of clay. And in Portuguese and Gallego, louro, obscure, chestnut color. In another work he added, de aquí Dios also is in Spanish, right? So thus in some sources, Loro referred to a darkish color, standing for later moreno. Now it became moreno. Loro became moreno. While in other sources, a so-called greenish yellow or dirty yellow, similar to that of the copperish American race. Copper color race of America, huh? Who's the shade of a penny, huh? Copper, huh? Cejador, as well as Coromina, cited earlier, refers to Loro as being derived from Loros or laurel, a tree whose leaves possess an obscure color. In this respect, laurel perhaps resembles olive, an equivalent sometimes used by the Italians and French. By 1778 to 1790, Loro had been dropped from later editions of Antonio de Nebrija's dictionary, but it did appear in Aniceto de Page's work. All right. It says, it is interesting that the Pages compares Loro with the color amulatoro, mulatto-ish, and with a moreno that tends towards black. On the other hand, the refrain would indicate that Loro referred to a ripe weed color. All right, so many uses, but in general, dark complexions. The decline of Loro. Perhaps the ambiguity of Loro is one of the factors which led to its replacement in Castilian and Catalan. Between 1569 and 1686, the published records from Valencia revealed that Loro was only applied on 3 occasions, all for new slaves registered in the 1570s. What were the other terms used, other than Negro or Blanco? They were Membrillo, Cocido, Codoni, Cube, used 365 times with all kinds of slaves, new and fugitive, and all registration books. And then you got Moreno, used 59 times, and Mulatto, used 22 times. Okay, that's what the other words are using. So then you got Claro, used once, and Oscuro, used twice. Occasionally, modifications occurred with Blanco, Membrillo, Membrillo, and Moreno, Membrillo, Claro, Moreno, Claro, Lloro. So then they start breaking it down even more. So thus in Valencia, Loro declined and was replaced primarily by Membrillo, Cocido, stewed queen's color, and secondarily by Moreno. Mulatto was used in only 22 cases, indicating that at least to 1686 it was not a popular term. A great portion, perhaps half of the slaves, were of Islamic origin. Individual descriptions included un hombre moreno, hombre de color, so on and so on. Dark black right here. The color terms Negro, Blanco, and Moreno were especially common for Muslims, Moro, slaves, with Moreno also being used for a man born of a slave owner and a slave. Picked up as a fugitive in 1564, he claimed to be free, although his mother was the slave of his father. The published materials do not identify American slaves separately by color, but a few inferences can be made. In books 205, 1569 to 70, 7 people from Indias were mentioned. In the same book, there were 9 of Membrillo color, along with 59 Blancos and 195 Negroes. Thus, the Americans were classified by one of these 3 color terms, okay? We're talking about American Indians classified as Negroes, guys. Pay attention. Some as so-called whites or Blancos, Membrillo or Loro. Again, thus the Americans were classified by one of these 3 color terms, all right? Negroes the most, you see that? Negroes the most. In book 207, 1571 to 8, there were 4 from Indias, with many people called Negro or Blanco, but only 22 Membrillos, 2 Mulattos, and Moreno, and 3 Yours. In book 208, 1579 to 85, there were 7 from Indias who had to be classified as being among the Membrillos, Mulattos, or Morenos. This is the Indians that call them Morenos, unless they were termed black or white or were unclassified by color. In 1659, as noted previously, a Spaniard stated that the Negroes then being captured in the Mediterranean and taken to Sicily had to be regarded as infidel Moros because they were of lionish color called Membrillo Cocido and were Muslims. According to another author, Fulani people were regarded as being also of color Mulatto, Membrillo, Cocho. And we know a lot of Fulani are very dark complexion. Mulatto, Membrillo, Cocido color in the slavery period. Before they were, the Fulani. Membrillo Cocido spread to the Americas, where in 1552 a female slave born in Spain was described as being of that color. In early colonial Mexico, according to Aguirre Beltran, the term amembrillados was used for persons who had lighter complexions than Negroes, and especially than Negroes atesados, or extremely black. Wow, atesados means extremely so-called black. He stated that it was a color similar to or the same as amulatado. In Mexico, the so-called dark mulatto, or mulatto pardo, here we go again with pardo, a mixture of African and American, that's the hijack. If anybody is darker, not from the Americas that they're mixing with, it must be a black European then. So I'm taking that as black European and American, was also called color cocho, as well as color pardo, color de rapadura, molasses, color champurrado or chocolate. Chocolate, huh? Color amarillito or yellowish, color de membrillo, color quebrado or broken color, color sambago and sambo, as well as simply cambujos, chinos, jarochos, and loros, and chiapas. Chinos, they're just being called things. This array of terms need not concern us here, except that it illustrates a proliferation of color designations in the 17th century, as well as the survival of Loro for a time in the Americas. As noted elsewhere, some Loros were allowed to go to the Americas from Spain, but between 1518 and 1530, the crown began to attempt to prevent any potentially seditious elements from traveling to the colonies. In 1526, only newly enslaved Negroes were to be allowed to go there as slaves. Wolofs of Senegal, Levantines, Middle Easterners of whatever color, persons raised among Muslims, and Negroes who had been in Spain for 2 years were all prohibited, along with all ex-Muslims and ex-Jews. All right, you guys see, this is that prohibition that was not letting certain people go to the Americas to settle, including, the cryptos, the Moors and the Sephardic Jews or ex-Jews. See, their children, heretics, and others. In 1530, slaves who were blancos, negros, loros, ni mulattoes were prohibited without express license of the crown. So I thought they were trying to get Negroes over there, right? Why wouldn't they be prohibiting certain people? In this instance, it would appear that loro and mulatto were used as similar or identical terms, with the implication of being associated with Muslims. Such slaves were to be confiscated, and if berberish of the caste of Muslims or Jews or mulattoes, Sephardic Jews, they were to be returned to Spain at the sender's cost. In this second enumeration, only the term mulatto is used, but since we know that many Muslims were called loros, we must assume that mulatto is used to stand for both the loros and mulattoes of the first enumeration. This usage helps to illustrate the period of transition from loro to mulatto, in other terms to be discussed elsewhere. In 1551, and again in 1552, King Carlos I, or King Charles I, issued a decree from Spain stating that los negros y loros, free or slave, could not carry any type of public arms, nor could they touch hands to arms against a Spaniard. They were to be severely punished indeed. This is the only other known use of loro in American colonial legislation, and we can assume, I think, that it refers to all classes of brown-skinned non-whites, including Americans. This is what I was about to say. They're saying los negros. What Negroes? Because remember, they were calling people of South America and Central America and the mainlands Negroes of the land, the Indians. And that's why I said this refers to all classes of brown-skinned people, including Americans. Including Americans. I'm trying to show you guys. A lot of people knew. All right? So-called Black Indians. Some writers have interpreted as being equivalent to mulatto, but such a usage would seem to exclude mestizos and non-whites, an unlikely intention. As will be discussed later, mestizo and mulatto appear in royal decrees in 1549 and replaced loro after 1552. The evolution of the term lauro was somewhat different in the Portuguese and Gallego languages. In Gallego, louro occurred in two senses, one learning in the red direction and one leaning in the red direction and one leaning towards the so-called black. More louro than carbon. In the medieval Cantigas del Rey Sabio, according to Julio Cageador and Franca, the usage is white and loro Muslims. On the other hand, Portuguese are white and black, right? Loro means black in this case, or dark-skinned Muslims. Light-skinned or dark-skinned Muslims, loros. On the other hand, Portuguese usage tended to emphasize the reddish, goldish, yellowish quality of wheat, as in Camões Luciadas, 1572. In Brazil, in particular, louro was used to refer to the descendants of Frenchmen. Loros, which means brown-skinned people, dark-skinned people in general, was used on the descendants of Frenchmen, guys. Huguenots, many from Normandy, huh? They were dark-skinned, huh? I told you, they were dark-skinned, huh? And Tupinamba women. So the mixture of these Frenchmen, possibly Huguenots with the Tupinamba women, Loros, okay? Thus the French Tupinamba mixed bloods were described as Loro, Alvo, white in parentheses, or Sardo, Sardinian colored. In 1587, a dictionary of 1646 equates Laura causa, a Laura thing, with Latin flavus, golden yellow, and rutilus, red, golden auburn. The term seems to have referred to hair color in particular or to light brown persons with blondish hair. But Barassi refers to lauro hair, and Nascentes in his dictionary states, de cor media entre o dorado o castaño that is a color between golden and clear or light chestnut, applied to hair. In the same vein, Gonsalves de Melo speaks of the mestizos and tipos loros, right? Let's see. Reddish found in northeastern Brazil and due possibly to Dutch-Brazilian intermixture, while Gilberto Freire refers to a minority of Loros dominating a proletariat of people of color. The fact that Loro in Portuguese came to refer to a lighter shade of color is in part explained by the widespread use of pardo as the more precise equivalent of Spanish loro. In short, pardo came to fulfill the fuscos dusky sub Niger or the N word, sub N word, right? You see that? Sub less than black. Function exercised by Loro in Castilian and Catalan, while Loro in Portuguese became more equivalent to Rubio as applied to hair in Castilian. So eventually the word Loro would change. They try to make it a lot more lighter and apply to lighter people or blonde people. You guys see what they're saying? Then Pardo was being used to describe the more darker complexion people. So the use of the term Pardo. The early evolution of Pardo in Castilian is distinct from that in Portuguese and Gallego. Fundamentally, Pardo, Pardillo pointed towards a gray shade in Spanish, once used to refer to the drab clothing worn by some common people. In Gallego, on the other hand, Pardo pointed toward the equivalent of fuscus, that is, darkish, dusky, and obscure, or dark. As a result, one never finds slaves classified as Pardo in Seville or Valencia in the 16th century, Loro being used instead. But in the Galicia region in 1521, one finds records of two slaves being sold who are termed Pardillo and Pardilla, while a third is termed a Loro. It is rather important to trace the use of Pardo in Portuguese and its later adaptation in American Spanish, because it is a term often interpreted by contemporary writers in a somewhat misleading manner. So modern people try to mistranslate, misrepresent the word, all right, in a misleading manner. Are they doing it on purpose, gatekeeping, so you won't know? They were talking about black folks back then. They were applying this word to black folks, black Indians, black Europeans. Huh. Corominas traces pardo back to Latin pardus, derived from the Greek pardos, or leopard or jaguar. Pardo, leopard, huh? Jaguar, pardus, spotted, 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 jaguar. Remember, just black jaguars. And relates his meaning to the obscure color of that animal. Yup, that's what we're talking about, guys. Black Panther. Black Panther, Pardo. It appears in Castilian and Gallego Portuguese from the 11th century onwards. Nebrija, in his dictionary of 1495, states Pardo, color of cloth. The Spanish Royal Academy has defined Pardo as del color de la tierra or de la piel del oso, so the color of the earth, that is, as an earth color or like the skin of the common bear. Bear got dark complexions, dark furs, right? Intermediate between black and white with a reddish, yellowish tint and darker than gray. On the other hand, this definition reflects modern usage, and in earlier times, as in Toledo documents of 1582 and many others, Spanish pardo is equated with gray. Examples will be given below. In Portuguese, the color pardo is mentioned as early as 1111 and 1258. A charter of 1182 published in 1293 from Alfonso I refers to suam pardum, although it is not certain whom the pardon was or if it was misspelling. A Gallego chronicle of the second half of the 14th century uses huis for castaño, chestnut brown, bru for castaño oscuro or dark brown, all right, escuro or dark, but does not use pardo. By the 15th century, however, pardo was being used in Portugal primarily for dusky non-Negroids, such as the Itzzagen or Asenegues of Mauritania, a people called Loros by users of Castilian. Pardo and Basso were also being used for mixed bloods in Portugal, the term mulatto not having appeared yet. Pardo clearly pointed toward an intermediate color between black and white and not towards race mixture. Not really about race mixture, guys. For example, pardo could be applied to unmixed Americans. Okay? Something in between very dark and very light, huh? When the Portuguese first reached Brazil in 1500, Pero Vaz de Caminha wrote that the native people, Fiscal deles eram pardos, so it says, their aspect is that of pardos, somewhat vermilion, somewhat reddish, with good faces and noses well made. Their hair is worn long. Pedro Alvarez Cabral, the leader of the expedition, said, in this Cabral not only stated that the Americans were pardos, but that the color pardo stood between the extremes of white and black. The extremes, right? A definition repeated over and over in Portuguese dictionaries up to the present time. The people of India were referred as to as Bassos by Vasco da Gama. An early Italian translation published in 1550 utilizes color berrettino for the pardo of Alvarez Cabral. This correspondence is significant because of a similar usage found in the diary of Alvise de Cada Mosto, an Italian who sailed with the Portuguese along the northwest African coast in the 1440s and 60s, and then wrote about his experience in 1464 and 1465 in describing the people of southern Mauritania. Cada Mosto stated that the Arabs of Hoden are brown or bruni men, and that the Sanagi are Berrettini men, a more forte bruni than Berrettini. Later he noted that the Senegal River was the first river of the land of Negroes, and that the said river divides the Negroes and the Berrettini of the Asanagi. They're not the same color, even in Senegal. You guys heard that? Thus the Asanagi, the Itzagan were Berrettini people, bordering upon black people to the south and brown Bruni Arabs to the north. Moreover, the Asanagi were more dark brown than Berrettini. It is interesting to see how a Portuguese scholar, Sebastião Francisco de Mendo Trigoso, translated Berrettini and Bruni into his language several centuries later. The Arabs who were Bruni in Italian become Pardo in Portuguese, all right? Talking about dark complexion people, while the phrase which stated that the Asanagi were more forte Bruni than Berrettini becomes, it says that thus amulatado and mulatto are equated with Berrettini and more pardo with forte Bruni, while a few pages later, those pardos camados asenegues replaced the Berrettini deti Asanagi, but somewhat later, os amulatados is substituted for Berrettini. So all different ways, different terms of describing different shades of dark-skinned people, okay? In any case, pardo can be seen as a color equivalent to brun, but also embracing Berrettino. The Asanagi Berbers of Mauritania and the native Brazilians fell within this range. All right, native Brazilians, which also embrace amuletado in a manner similar to that remarked upon for Loro and Membrillo Cocido. Hunt, stating in a description of the Brazilians in 1557, calls them brown. He calls them what? Brown skin in English translation, and pardo in Spanish translations. Pardo, again, is brown complexion in many cases. The Jesuit letters relating to Brazil between 1549 and 1568, along with reports of the 1570s and 80s, do not use the term pardo. Negro, as noted, being often used instead. Okay? So when they didn't use pardo, they used Negro. And who they talking about here, guys? They're talking about American Indians. If they're not calling them Loros or Pardos, they're calling them Negroes. All dark complexions. Loros, Pardo, Negro, right? Swarty people. Swarty, dark complexion people, different shades. True old world, many different diversity. Again, Negro, as noted, being often used instead for American Indians, guys, in Brazil. Come on now, wake up. One source does, however, use preto. They even call them pretos, which means black. In Portuguese, preto. And muito baza, very swarty. Muito baza, swarty. In relation, very swarty. In relation to the native people. Okay? So right here, the Tupinambas. Muito baza, very swarty. Muito baza, very dark, very dark. Look, very dark. Very dark, as we shall see, could be embraced by Pardo. We're talking about American Indians. Wake up, guys. They're trying to say we're blackwashing. Okay? They try to say we were blackwashing. In discussing the children of Portuguese fathers, and black mothers in the Congo, these Portuguese were probably so-called black too. In 1579 to 1591, a Portuguese translator from Italian states that the children of the same so-called white Portuguese born in those lands, I bet you these were black, of Congolese women are Negroes or white or Pardos. See, they're just Pardos. They're still dark complexion, the kids, whom the Spanish call mulattoes. And so mulatto means two people from two different nations mixing. They are two people from Portugal and Congo, two different nations mixing. They get a mulatto. It's not about just color. And so the children of the Portuguese who were born to Congolese women lean more towards the white color or the white class. That's the hijack, is what I'm saying. What Portuguese? Show me. Let's talk about what he looks like. Prove it to me. The native Congo people are Negroes and some less leaning more towards Basso. Yet they have black kinky hair and some also reddish. Thus, the mixed children could be white, black, or Pardo in color. Children whom the Spaniards called mulattoes. Pardo was clearly being used as intermediate color as was Basso. All right, so again, guys, be ready to dodge the hijack. Remember, this was written back in the 90s or 80s when they still, believe in the whole out of Africa stuff and that every Negro or anybody with woolly hair had to have come from that part of the world. So, we discern the info, right? Pull out the baby, starts the hijacks. A French translation of the above utilizes olivatres or olivish for Pardos. In his epic poem Luciadas, 1571, Louis de Camoens used the term gente, Baza, to refer to the people of Arabia and the Persian Gulf. Manuel de Faria commented upon this in 1639 by saying that Camoens meant that the people of those parts were of a color that is neither white nor black, which in Portugal we call pardo or amulatado, because the children of black and white are called mulattoes, who from this mixture of parents have this color dudoso or neutral between the two, very bad without doubt, because hasta allí it is bad to be neutral, a horrible thing. In this interesting statement, Faria equates baso with pardo and amulatado, but essentially what is meant is a doubtful color, a neutral one between black and white, and this neutral color is without doubt very bad. It is horrible and negative to be of a neutral color. What? Why Faria regarded brownish shades as being horrible for human beings is not clear, but perhaps it reflects the growth of racism and disdain for mixed bloods. On the other hand, it also seems to relate to the color dualism referred to earlier, wherein colors between black and white are regarded as being doubtful. Again, the mixture of black and white pigments produces gray. One of the meanings of pardo, as noted, in this case, the artist gray is confused with the browns of Northern Africans, Brazilians, Indians, and mixed bloods, and all are categorized as neutral. Yeah. In any event, during the 17th century, pardo was extended to include mixed bloods of various kinds. In 1681, for example, a writer notes that there were many mulattoes and pardos in Angola, a result of white men having children with black women. All right, again, this is their classification of brown. Pardo means brown-skinned people. Brown-skinned people can produce other brown-skinned people. It doesn't necessarily mean the parents are white. Or this is what I'm saying, guys. Starts to hijack. What Europeans or so-called white men? Give me the name and prove to me that they are pale skin. Are you sure they're not being described as swarthy or brown or in any of the primary sources? That's what I'm trying you to look up and prove to me. If you think what I'm saying, if it bothers you what I'm saying right now. Because again, this is modern concepts of that. So we're still learning. Part of we already know, man, dark complexion, brown skinned people, right? They're using it on Negro people too. So in the 1680s, also certain Pardos of Bahia protested that they were being excluded from Jesuit schools. Antonio Vieira responded that they had been excluded because upper-class whites would not attend with them since they were of veiled and obscure origin. In 1690s, an Italian visitor to Bahia stated that the population there was divided into four classes: the Bianchi, the white, the Negri from Ethiopia, the Mulati or Party, and the Indiges Nacionali, ovvero Brasiliani. The Pardos were homini di color olivastro. All right, so let me see. Supposedly, no, that is to say, the Pardos were of olive color, the illegitimate children of white men and black women, and were commonly called Mulati and Party. Supposedly, there were about 8,000 to 10,000 of these Mulati or Party in Bahia. The native Brazilians were neither white nor black nor olivastri, but more the color of dark vermilion. and few of them were living in the city itself. The whites numbered some 20,000, the black slaves some 50,000. See how they said the native Brazilians and now the black slaves? They're mixing, separating peoples. What black slaves? A lot of these so-called black slaves could be Indians too, and black Europeans. Some 50,000, the intermediate olive-colored people, some 8,000, 10,000, as noted for a total of 80,000 or more, leaving perhaps 2,000 or less for unmixed vermilion Americans. The situation of Bahia in the late 17th century represents quite a contrast with earlier periods. For one thing, earlier Italian writers usually regarded the Americans as being of olive color. Secondly, in 1584, the population of Bahia totaled 12,000, of whom 6,000 were Americans. 4,000 were Prestos de Guinea and 2,000 were Portuguese. De Guinea, huh? You mean from Cape Verde? Who then were the olive-colored Pardos and Mulattoes of the 1690s. We know that they were not a simple mixture of Portuguese and African. First, because the whites were very definitely part of American and their children by black women would have to be also part American. Secondly, as will be discussed later, the sex ratios among African slaves were heavily, so this part is hijacked, right? They're like, who are these people, these dark complexion people in the 1690s? On the other hand, it is significant that Suseli's use of the term party reflects a growing tendency to focus on the black-white nexus to ignore the American component, to ignore the American part ancestry in that. When you start turning on the world into black and white, using that as genealogy, then you're leaving out the American component, basically. This will be discussed in a subsequent section, but here it is useful to quote from a Brazilian author to the effect that in 1769 to 70, the governor of Para pode criar Companhia de dos Hombres Pardos. All right, thus a military company of Pardos was authorized, and the Pardos in this case were perhaps Americans. These brown-skinned people were Americans. Separate companies were authorized for blacks to be called the Henriques. The blacks were called the Enriques. Come on now. Why are they giving a Spanish name, these so-called blacks? After Enrique Diaz, who, as noted, had led non-white troops against the Dutch. Well, he was probably a non-white too, Enrique Diaz. Sounds like a crypto Jew to me. At this point, let us examine Portuguese dictionaries to understand more about the evolution of Pardo and the related term Basso. In the 1560s, Cardoso equated both Pardo and Bassa Causa with Latin Fuscus. This was repeated in the 1643 edition of this dictionary, where Barbosa 1611 stated the same, Bassa Causa o Pardo Fuscus, sub Niger Pereira 1646 repeats the same for Pardo Causa. Interestingly, he also has Carafus, Homo Fusca Faci, thus utilizing a term which later became popular in Brazil for African American mixed bloods. See, these terms are being used on so-called black folks, guys. This is what I'm trying to tell you. Cafus, Cafuso, Carafus. That is dusky face. Bluetooth 1712 to 20 has the following. Pardazo, muito pardo, Cusa de pardo escuro or pardo, entre blanco preto, right? Major part of the nose, total gases. Thus, pardo is defined as being a color between black and white, but in addition, for a pardo person, one is referred to the definition for mulatto. Several old sayings are then quoted. May, dark, gray. June, clear. At night, all of the cats are pardos, dark. Pardos, dark. I told you pardo means dark complexion, thus indicating that pardo still essentially means fuscus, dark or obscure. This remains basically the same in 1789 edition. Bluto also defines the term trigueiro, wheat-colored, as follows. Trigueiro then was similar to pardo and embracing fuscus, gray and earth colors, but perhaps it was seen as a slightly lighter shade, but one essentially variable and obscure, or dark. For Bluto, native Brazilians were of bronze color. Bronze, copper colored. A Portuguese Dutch dictionary of 1718 equated pardo with the donkerverwig and swartig, that is with both darkish and blackish, okay, pardo. Pardo, guys, listen, a Portuguese Dutch dictionary from 1718, pardo is darkish and blackish. An English Portuguese dictionary of the late 18th century, on the other hand, says pardo is gray and for pardo human, see mulatto. A mulatto is described as being a tawny color from the mixture of black and white. A Portuguese-French dictionary of the same period has pardo, fusco oscuro, gris brun noirâtre, qui tire sud le nord. It also has cabra, pardo, mulatto, mulatre, norio. Thus we see that pardo still pointed towards a range of shades, dark, obscure, which is literally the way we say dark in Spanish, oscuro, gray, brown, blackish, okay, leaning towards black, but also the term cabra, which equated with both pardo and mulatto, a dark-colored person, okay, a dark-colored person, pardo. That's what I'm saying. Juan Pardo is named Juan Pardo. His people were pardo, dark-complexioned people, dark-colored people. In Brazil, cabra came to be used for persons who were of a mixture of African and either American or European. All right, so what African? The Portuguese English dictionary also has cabra, but equates it with Indians who shoot betel. In 1836, Constancio defined pardo as the como do leopardo, like a leopard. So that is a leopard-like color, obscure like that of mulattoes, people of dark skin color. Pardo. A German-Portuguese dictionary of 1891 equated pardo with brown and dunkelgrau, brown and dark gray. But significantly, German mulatte was equivalent to pardo as well as to mulatto. It seems quite clear that pardo in Portuguese, unlike loro in Castilian, proved to be a very adaptive term. Its ambiguity has allowed it to evolve in the direction of becoming a class term, especially in Brazil. That is, from being a general range of darker, brownish shades between black and white, pardo has gradually acquired other connotations which make it not only an equivalent of mulatto, confuso, mestizo, and so on in Brazil, as well as still retaining color properties, but also an equivalent of colored in English and kleurlingen in Dutch. This evolution will be discussed further under the topic of people of color, all right, in a later on chapter we're going to get to. So continuing in the book, it says here, Pardos and Morenos in the Spanish colonies. Now let us review briefly the use of pardo in the Castilian language in order to discover the gradual adoption in the Americas of Portuguese usage. As noted earlier, pardo began as fuscus equivalent, but with gray as the most direct translation. In 1520, Nebrija stated pardo, color of cloth, fuscus. In 1534, Castilian pardillo was equated with Latin grisus leucophilus, Dutch grau, French gris, and Italian grixo. Auden in 1607 defined pardo color as gris de minime and pardillo as gris blanc, gris argente. So Covarrubias, 1611 and 1647 stated, right, thus pardo was essentially wool gray, both as the color of sheep and of the wool cloth. It was the color of the clothing of the lower classes. The same proverb about all of the cats at night being pardos is given as in other sources. Minshew 1617 equates pardo color with Latin glaucus leucophilus and with English gray or russet color, but under brown. He includes as an equivalent pardo a colore pardi animalis, Latin fuscus sub niger. Basso or swarty is equated with color interum fuscum and negru. It's sad gray, negru, negru. That's almost like saying night in gray. Negru, gris, and sad gray or light black. In 1599, paradisco was equated with somewhat grayish or dusky color. In general, pardo continued to be equated with gray in Spanish usage for some time, until gradually conforming with the definition of the Royal Academy already referred to an earth color, or the color of the skin of the common bear, a yellowish red more obscure than gray. An additional change is reflected in the notation of a 1901 dictionary that pardo in Cuba and Puerto Rico was the equivalent of mulatto, but not in Spain. Santa Maria, in his Dictionary of Americanisms, notes that in Argentina and the Caribbean, the term pardo was used for all mulatto or hija de negro blanco. So it goes on, right? In Spanish says, thus Santa Maria knows that in general, Pardo had come to refer to all people of color, including native-born blacks in Cuba and Puerto Rico, all right? Native-born blacks in Cuba and Puerto Rico, and especially mixtures of American and any type of black, any type of Negro, any other mixture, American, I mean Indian with any other foreign dark-skinned person with European. In Brazil, Pardo referred especially to the mixture of mulattoes with Americans, while in Argentina and the Caribbean, it referred especially to black-white mixtures, so-called black, so-called white. We cannot, in fact, accept Santa Maria's definition in every detail, but they do serve to illustrate the widespread use of Pardo in Spanish-speaking regions of the Americas. This usage commenced in the 17th century, probably as a result of the widespread mixture of Africans and Americans such the hijacks, which produced many children of dark brown shades. All right, so what are we talking about? We know the Americans were Pardo already, brown-skinned people, even dark brown shades. Then any outside so-called black person would be mostly European, not Africans, which produced many children of dark brown shades. Aguirre Beltran knows that in Mexico in the 17th century, the mulatto Pardo was half American and half maybe European, while the mestizo Pardo was half American, quarter European and quarter European. See, he goes on to say that the dark mulatto was the result of the mixture of so-called Negro and Indian. What if the Indians are Negroes too? See, that makes no sense. What Negro? A black European, maybe? And a Indian? The dark mulattoes were without a doubt the most numerous single group in New Spain, dark mulattoes. And their skin color inspired a curious and varied series of adjectives. They were said to have color pardo, dark color pardo, pardo meaning dark, I told you. Along with other shades listed earlier, including membrillo. The mestizo pardo was the result of the marriage of a mulatto pardo with a mestizo. A mulatto pardo, a dark-colored mulatto with a mestizo. Now they're getting creative. Now they're going crazy with it. As will be noted later, the mixed children of Americans and other black folks, possibly from Europe, were called mulattoes in the Spanish Empire for some time, even including Sephardic Jews and Moors, right, were of that color. The term pardo appears in essence as a modifier implying dark. However, its meaning could also with time become more general, all right, implying dark. Pardo. In 1646, Juan de Solorzano completed a work based upon a decade of experience in Peru in the 1620s. He remarked that the children of Negroes and free Negroes are called morenos or pardos, and these people are coming to live regularly in some places. There are militia companies of them. Solorzano then refers to royal legislation of 1623 and 1625, which mentions los morenos libres, but says nothing about pardos and Negroes. Solorzano also takes note of a law that los negros y negras libres deben pagar tributo, so they must pay tribute. That is to say, free blacks ought to pay tribute along with their children by American fathers and mothers. In the earlier paragraph being called morenos or pardos, but it could mean that they were part American or part European to some degree, a little bit of both, most likely. Today, moreno serves as a euphemism for Negro. Among some Spaniards and several writers have supposed that this usage commenced at an early date, especially as the word Negro came to be equivalent to slave. All right, it came what? Synonymous with slave. They just started using even anybody being labeled Negro. Now that was the slave. Could have been a black European, could have been a black Indian. Indeed, it may be true that some Negroes who were free could have been so denominated, but after a generation or two, it is also likely that a large number of slaves must have been of mixed American and black European origin to one degree or another, and there may have actually been some slight lightening of skin color, especially among morenos libres, who may have been descended from an American female. Aguirre Beltran provides several examples of persons who were of mixed European and American, but who look like Negroes. There you go. But what do you mean? These are black if they got European and American Indian blood, but they're black. Just like I find in people's genealogy. You're trying to say the African, where's the African coming in? Such persons could have easily been designated as morenos, especially in regions such as Panama, Cuba, or Puerto Rico, where much American and European mixture occurred. As early as 1501, Spaniards seized certain Americans of the Gulf of Uraba, Darien, who were de color moreno, likewise Cumilla. So listen, again, Spaniards seized certain Americans of the Gulf of Uraba and Panama who were of the color moreno. He's talking about American Indians who were of the color moreno, black. Likewise, Cumilla in the 1740s, brown-skinned people, described the Otomacos. Look, Cumilla, primary sources in the 1740s described the Otomaco Indians as pretos, as black folks, as morenos, as black folks, guys. All right, wake up. Do you remember who you are? That's what I'm saying. Who are they really enslaving? They grabbed them. Thus, the term moreno could be applied to presumably unmixed Americans. Okay, body bag for the illusion. All right, shout out to Drop. All right, remember, wake up. Odin in 1607 defined moreno as brun, nor, obscure, color de olives. That is very similar to Loro and Pardo or Olivastre. Minshew 1599 has moreno translated as Mori, color brown, dark, duskish, and hombre moreno as a man of swartish hue, swarty, and pan moreno as brown bread. Minshew 1617 has moreno equivalent to fuscus, sub-Niger, brown, dark, duskish. Initially then we can suggest that moreno would maintain some connection with its usage in Spain, whereas noted it was a color lighter than Negro and was used for many Muslims. A Spanish decree of 1623 refers to the free morenos of Cuba as being distinct from Negros cimarrones. Oh. The free morenos had houses, fields, horses, and so on, and were being disturbed by those searching for runaway Negroes. We can conjecture that the free morenos could have been generally dark-skinned or even European American peasants, since many kinds of persons could have been hiding runaways. Negro in this case does not seem to be the equivalent of slave. All right, in this case it wasn't. A document of 1671 relating to Cuba notes that in those parts, the mulattoes were called pardos, and that an order of 1634 had prohibited service as soldiers to mulattoes, morenos, and mestizos. But because of a shortage of whites, so-called whites, this order was partially waived for pardos or mulattoes. The term moreno is not totally clarified by the above, but pardo clearly refers to non-blacks. A modern Brazilian dictionary defines moreno as branco menos claro. Right? In other words, a rather light brown color, leaning towards white. That's what they're saying, that dictionary, they quoted. Which one it is? It's probably a modern one. It may be that the theory that moreno was a polite term for Negro in the Spanish Empire originates with scholars, especially North Americans, who tend to classify all part black Europeans as Negroes. Thus, this perspective, any term other than Negro, black, becomes a euphemism. In any case, by the 1640s and 50s, the word pardo began to be used in the Spanish Empire as a term referring to persons of mixed American and European ancestry, that is, mulattoes, or to persons resembling such a mixture. In 1656, for example, there is a story about a Spaniard who met an old, well-dressed and white-haired mulatto. Having brought the coach to a stop, he asked the pardo to approach and ask him, "What is your name?" The pardo told him. In 1681, a petition arrived in Spain from Peru. All right, so that is in Spanish. It says, in short, a group of pardos naturales, or natural pardos, meaning probably local people, local brown-skinned people, dark-skinned people, petitioned the crown for relief in conformity with the law of 1609 prohibiting personal service by Indians, thus implying clearly that pardos and cuarterones or quarterbloods were of American ancestry. Pardo also continued to be used as a color term meaning dark. Joseph Gumilla, in describing the skin colors of Venezuelan natives, stated that those who lived in the forests were casi blancos, almost white. Those who went out in open country were trigueños, wheat brown, while the Otomacos who navigated the rivers were prietos y morenos. Okay? They're letting you know, guys, here. We're going to highlight all this. There was diversity here. Pardos being used for dark-skinned people. They even calling Indians light-skinned, in the middle, brown, and very dark, prietos or morenos, so-called black. In general, however, the Americans son de color trigueño. In general, they are brown. Jamás, so it says. Thus, trigueño was the average color, with some being more pardo, some being more dark, and others less dark. Just as many Europeans, especially in the countryside, were not white but trigueño. Many Europeans were what? A brown complexion. The Americans who were moreno and prieto, we're talking about American Indians who were morenos, dark-skinned people, pretos, so-called black or Negroes, seem to have been regarded by Gumila as being darker than Pardo, or Trigueño Pardo, or even darker, these Moreno Preto tribes of South America and the Darien, Panama, would have implied. In any case, one can again see the inherent difficulty of using color terms to differentiate between the various peoples of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, since Americans themselves could range over almost the entire spectrum of browns, okay? We had diversity here, all the way to so-called black and all the way to very light skin, light so-called skin, light complexion. In any case, the word pardo gradually gained in importance. It is very, so I skipped it. Yeah. Since Americans thus could range from almost entire spectrum of browns from near white to near black. In any case, the word pardo gradually gained in importance, and very ambiguity and vagueness undoubtedly facilitated its general spread until, as we shall see later, it comes to be virtually the equivalent of colored. Eventually, it became the word colored, guys. You see that? Pardo. Who's colored now? In many Spanish-speaking regions, it should be stressed that pardo, as a relational term, dark, had a vagueness that could make it more useful than a specific color descriptive such as pardo equals gray. Thus, a shift in meaning made it possible for pardo to eventually fulfill similar functions in Brazil and in Spanish-speaking areas. All right. And we continue in the book. This section of the book is called Colored Terms in English and Other Languages. There is no doubt but that Spain and Portugal led the way in developing colored terms, which tended to become group designations. Other cultures tended to use colored terms which remained only colored descriptors. This is true apparently with Italian, where early use was made of Berrettini, Bruni, Olivegno, Color di Olivo, and Olivastro, for the Berbers of southern Mauritania and for the Americans of Brazil. The latter were also called of the color of the olive, as were many Pacific Islanders, by Pigafetta in 1519 and 21, with Magellan and Olivastro e più presto nigri, olivish and almost black, in 1533. Generally, Berrettino and olive were used as equivalents to pardo and amuletado, and both points towards an obscure color or a dark color, right? Berrettino is described as grigio, verdognolo, or grigio, greenish gray or gray, but the term may have been influenced by birrus, obscuros, or by Latin venetus, used by an equivalent to pardo by Nebrija. In English, the term tawny, for a time, almost became a designation for Americans and for similar intermediate peoples. In 1559, one author stated, as the world's sun makes the more black the European white, the American tawny. This usage continued for many years, as noted previously. A London pageant of 1672 depicted tawny Moors working and playing music in West India. Tawny Moors playing music in West India in the Caribbean, huh? Who's these tawny Moors? The Indians. And a woman with a tawny face declared, that I, the better may attention draw, be pleased to know I am America. You see? We're talking about the Indians being called tawny Moors. For many centuries, America was depicted as Native American woman, tawny Moors. In 1695, plantation scene depicted Negroes, tawnies, Virginia planters, and so on. Okay, talking about Indians here. In 1686, a letter from New England stated, though he was a tawny Moor Indian, a tawny Moor, yet he was a converted one. We shall have cause to make occasional reference to the term Tawny and Tawny Moor as a designation for Americans elsewhere, okay? This was real history, guys. On the other hand, it is a descriptor which did not endure, being eventually replaced by the concept of redskin. Copper colored, huh? Red, man. An English so-called red. An Englishman who had lived in Spain for many years visited Mexico and Central America in 1625 to 1637. This man, Thomas Gage, served as a parish priest in Guatemala. He wrote around 1645 of the servant women of Mexico City. He says, nay, a blackamoor. All right, this is the native women, right? Nay, a blackamoor or tawny young maid and slave will make hard shift, but she will be in fashion. The attire of this baser sort of people, of blackamoors and mulattoes, which are of a mixed nature of Spaniards and blackamoors, is so light, and their carriage so enticing that many Spaniards, even of the better sort, disdain their wives for them. Their bare black and tawny breasts are covered with boobs hanging from their chains of pearls. All right, what they call them the native blackamoors, they call them the Indians, right? The use of tawny in this context is not clear, but it would seem to refer to the color of Americans, since there must have been a preponderance of tawny American maids in Mexico City. Mulattoes, which are of a mixed nature of Spaniards and blackamoors, huh? What does that mean? Can be interpreted as referring to the mixture of Europeans and Indians, right? Black Europeans and Indians with tawny people. Although Gage's construction is ambiguous, it may be that Gage meant tawny to include all intermediate colored people. It may be, so they're guessing all this. It could be, it may be. We know the real history, so base it off of that. Who's mixing with the local people? Dun, we know the name Dun, we know the word Dun means so-called black, dark skin, dark brown, dull brown or grayish brown, although treated as an equivalent for Loro in 1599 by Minshew, never became a group term in English. Minshew equated brown with Italian Bruno, Fusco with Castilian Portuguese Bruno, Basso a color Leonis, Subnigri, and with Moreno and Pardo, as well as with Bauticos, from the people of the Baetica region of Spain, who were originally soot-colored and castaños, chestnut. In actual practice, English brown was originally a very dark. Again, listen, when it came to the English using the word brown, right? English brown was originally a very dark, dusky color, okay? That's what brown meant to them, a very dark, dusky color, corresponding to Portuguese basso and pardo. And Latin Fuscus sub Niger, one source of 1570 has brown, black, a tad brown Fuscus, and in 1449 the color of a storm was brown, while in 1325 the world was described as well brun after the sun went down. In 1668 one writer stated, as brown as evening, thus dusk would be a good translation. Samuel Johnson believed that a brown color always possessed black as part of its compound. In a way, it is strange that brown did not become the term widely used for Loros and Pardos, but it would appear that English black was used and is used. Okay, look, when we're talking about it, it's funny how, even though these people are really brown, literally like today, right? It's funny that it would appear that English black was used instead of the brown, and is used in such a broad manner as to embrace all darker shades of human brown. They're using black, a crayon color, to describe brown-skinned people, guys. Even tawny, a lighter shade of brown mixed with yellow or orange, has failed to survive the humans except in the form of tan or tanned. The same circumstances seem to hold true for Dutch Bruin being dominated by zwart. All right, being dominated by zwart. All right, so we continue. And it says here, the shift of official Iberian terminology from a color to a mixture emphasis. All right, we're almost done with this reading today, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Let's see what it says here. Container says, one of the significant occurrences in the 16th century is that the interest of Spaniards and Portuguese begins to gradually shift from simply describing all intermediate colored people, by the same general color reference terms to one wherein people of mixed ancestry are singled out by new descriptors, especially mestizo and mulatto. Of course, the use of color terms persists, but as noted with Pardo, one tends to see partial identification of this term with mixed blood status. The shift of emphasis is, I believe, quite significant. In general, it correlates with the rise of overseas colonialism and in all likelihood with the appearance of racist caste systems in those areas. That racist views comes into play now. Mestizo, which literally means mixed, has already been referred to in connection with the discussion of hybrid. As will be recalled, hybrid referred to almost any kind of mixture of wild and tame, of citizen and non-citizen, okay? Legal terms, of resident and traveler, a foreigner and a traveler, or a person who lives here native and a traveler. It possessed no racial implications. Remember that hybrid, originally, that's what it meant. Mestizo and its equivalents, especially métis of métif in French, seem to have appeared primarily as a referent to mixtures of a similar nature to hybrid, and particularly of different kinds of animals. We might argue that growing prejudice was responsible for their application to human beings as physically close as Americans are to Europeans. On the other hand, it may well be that mestizo developed primarily as a way to designate persons whose culture and social status were felt to be distinctive from those of either parent group. Thus, initially at least, its use may have primarily pointed not towards biology, but towards culture, okay? A person whose parents are from different distinctive groups, right? Cultural, social groups. An early use of the Latin root mixtus occurs in a statement describing the Mozarabis, the Arabized Christians of Muslim Spain. Thus, mix was used in a cultural sense, referring to their physical juxtaposition against Arabs. Continuing, it says the use of mestizo, a shift towards racialism and caste. The term mestizo does not appear in the Nebrija dictionaries of 1495 or 1520, although mezcla, mesturar, and relative or related words are included. Mestizo also is not a word found in Santa Rosa de Biberto's study of the medieval Portuguese language. Its first known appearance is in Cardoso's Portuguese dictionary of 1560s, when it is equated with Latin hybria, corrected to hybris, hybrida, in the 1643 edition. Mestizo is treated as something of an equivalent of mulatto by Cardoso, since the latter is also equated with hybrida, but mestizo refers to a broader range of mixtures. Minshu's Spanish-English Dictionary of 1599 defined mestizo as that which has come or sprung of a mixture of two kinds, a black Moor and a Christian. Look, a black Moor and a Christian, that's two different cultures. Two different kinds, huh? Mixing, that's what a mestizo is, huh? A mongrel dog or beast. This approach is maintained by Minshew in 1617 when he states of mestizo, Latin hybris, English a mongrel, and also where he equates mongrel with French chien mestis, mixed dog, Spanish mestizo, and Latin hybris, hybrida, as well as with mulatto. Adulterium is implied with when hybrida is applied to humans, Minshew notes. Woden, in his 1607 Spanish-French dictionary, has the following. Mestizo, right, and he has these definitions. One who is of two races, as the child of a Moor and a white, also applied to dogs and other animals. The term mulatto also refers to demi-Moors, half-Moors, the children of a white and a Moor, a so-called white. Remember, free whites include Moors, so which one is it, right? And also to a small mule. Thus, mestizo and mulatto continue to have the same meaning, except that mestizo, and even more metis, refers to a broader range of mixtures. That is, not just to mules or humans. Podenco is now translated as hound. Oden's 1625 edition repeats the above, except that he adds to the definition of mestizo, right? Thus, a half Christian, half non-Christian child would be of mestizo. Oden's 1639 to 1640 edition remained the same as the 1625, except that Dutch equivalents were added. That is, a mestizo was one derived from different origins or nations. a different origins or nations. Different nations, like a black European and an Indian could be different nations. The same as Moloch, or from a dog and a cat, or the child of Christian and a heathen. Even a religious way, two different religions, two different spiritualities coming together, then their child is mestizo. All right, guys. Mulatto was also equated with Moloch, but again, mulatto was not applied to animals other than mules. Covarrubias, 1611 and 1647, defined Spanish mestizo in terms of mixture only among animals. Right? Barbosa, 1611, preserves a conservative Portuguese perspective and equating mestizo with hybris, hybrida, as does Pereira, 1646. Pereira also knows that both mestizo and mulatto imply adultery or the mixture of native and a stranger. See, it doesn't matter about color. It's not always about color. You guys understand? These tendencies continue in Spanish with, for example, Sobrinos, 1721 dictionary. Okay? So thus mestizo referred to both Christian, pagan, and animal mixtures, while French métis referred only to the latter. Wow, animal mixtures. Between 1778 and 1790 editions of Nebrija's Dictionary of Spanish, a reference to los mestizos of Spaniard and Indians is added to the earlier hybrid definition. Santa Maria's Dictionary of Americanismos, 1942, notes that mestizo refers to the person born of father and mother of different raza, and especially to the child of the white man and Indian, or the Indian man and the white woman, right, or Europeans. Thus, we can see a change from hybrid, including animals with its variety of meanings, including interreligious mixture, to the more modern emphasis upon race. Also, of course, the fact that mestizo came to be applied in the Spanish-speaking Americas to primarily European American mixed bloods is recognized, okay? European American. Trends in the Portuguese language are overall similar to those in Spanish. An English Portuguese dictionary of 1701 has for mestizo any creature of mixed generation, as dogs or swine. Bluto in 1712 goes into much greater detail, right? So thus hybrida, tradition is preserved for animals, example, the union of wild with domestic, and so on. For humans, a child born of parents of two different nations. Again, parents of two different nations, not necessarily colors, is a mestizo. Okay? The example being the mixture of Portuguese and Indian, a black Portuguese or a white or black and Indian. In the 1789 edition of Bluetooth, the example is of Ofinio de Europao con India. All right, thus mestizo embraces the union of European with mulatto as well as European with Indian. It may be that a child born of black and white parents might not have been considered a mestizo. All right, not necessarily. The Sosa and the Costa, these are black European families. 1784 state that the French mulâtre is equivalent to mestizo, as well as mulatto and Portuguese. For French métis, they give both mestizo and mulatto and state. Right? The 1794 Portuguese-French version gives mestizo, nacido de animais de diferentes. All right, so thus mestizo continued to apply to animal mixtures, as well as to mixtures among humans involving parents of different quality. Parents of different quality, meaning social position or caste, countries or religions. It's not just about color, guys. All right, pay attention. I hope you guys, I know it's a long reading today, but hope you're understanding everything that's being said so you have context. Mulatto and mestizo are treated as equivalents, except that only the latter applies to animals generally. A Portuguese-English dictionary of 1783 states of mestizo, mongrel, mestizo born of Indian and Portuguese parents, also mongrel in general. The tendency to use mestizo for many or all kinds of mixtures continues. Constancio, 1836, says of mestizo, filho de animales de especies o razas diferentes. All right, and that will go, let's see. So reference is made to animals of different species or races and to European or white mixture with Indians, Native Americans, or mulattoes. This type of definition continues until 1900, but thereafter the mention of animals is usually dropped. Characteristically, virtually all modern dictionaries of Portuguese equate mestizo with any mixture involving parents of different races. It made reference to mulattoes, a type of mestizo. So as time went on, they kept changing the definition, right? Especially into modern times now. A pardo may also be a mestizo, and the cobote of Brazil is seen as the mestizo de negro e indio. All right. Thus, mestizo in Portuguese has retained its basic meaning of mixed, but the kinds of mixture included have been reduced to human ones only, and more significantly to racial ones as opposed to cultural, social, inter-ethnic, and interreligious mixtures. The triumph of rationalist modern idea of race can therefore be seen in the evolution of the term. That is to say that early modern world placed greater stress on the religion, class, local origin, and culture, while the modern Western mind has elected so-called race as an especially pertinent criterion, okay? Now race is important. Now it became a thing. Of course, dictionaries are usually from 50 to 100 years behind the actual speech practices of people. It would seem, and European dictionaries often were especially slow in reflecting usage in colonial areas. We must therefore look at a few examples of actual practice to understand the meaning of mestizo. The widespread use of mestizo began so far as my data illustrates, not in the Iberian Peninsula, but in India, Brazil, and the Caribbean, approximately simultaneously. The Portuguese, by the first half of the 16th century, began to produce large numbers of mixed bloods. All right, the Portuguese, right? At that time, who's the Portuguese? These are swarthy folks, the dark-skinned people in general. They began to what? Produce large numbers of mixed bloods, right? Don't think of color only, because these are black Portuguese more. Pardo seems not to have been used for such persons. Instead, they were called mestizos, mamalucos, and mulattoes, depending on the geographical region. In India and the East Indies, the Portuguese used the term mestizo to refer to mixed bloods who were half Asian, right, and Portuguese, as early as 1547. Such persons could be half Indian, half Malay, and so on. Much later, the word topaz came to also be used for such persons, derived from an Indian term meaning bilingual interpreter. During the 16th century, however, mestizo or mestico, or mestizo, yeah, and mestizo was used commonly, as noted by the Italian traveler Carletti, who stated in 1590s that the mixed bloods in Bengal were called mestices. In 1585, Sassetti used mestici. In the 1601 to 1611 period, the Frenchman Pirard de Laval utilized the French equivalents métisses and métis to refer to the Portuguese mixed bloods of India. In Brazil, the Portuguese do not seem to have utilized any terms for mixed bloods in the 16th century, except for Mamaluco and Mestizo. Mamaluco appears in Jesuit letters as early as 1551, while Mestizo appears in 1552. Neither term is defined when first used, suggesting that the readers will understand, the readers being Jesuits in Coimbra, Portugal, in the case of Mamaluco, and a Jesuit in Lisbon in the case of Mamaluco and Mestiza in 1552. Mamaluco is later defined as referring to half white or half Christian. Like, that's a big difference, right? Look, half white or half Christian. Which one is it? That's two different things, right? This is what I'm saying. Don't always think white means just pale skin. It's a status. They just mean Christian. And half American persons. And it remains, so Mamaluco was a Christian, so-called Christian and an Indian. Mamaluco. And it remains a common term in Brazil for such a mixture. The spelling is later changed to Mameluco, a result, no doubt, of the influence of similar sounding words of Arabic origin. Mamaluco appears to be a Tupi term. All right, that's an Indian word. The word mestizo was used in a vague and general sense in the Jesuit letters. However, ordinarily it had the same meaning as Mamaluco, since the Jesuits were concerned primarily with Americans and part Americans. For example, in 1552, a Jesuit father confessed certain women mestizas by means of an interpreter, thus indicating perhaps that they were Tupi speakers. The later use of the word mestizo in Brazil is quite complicated and will be referred to in connection with my discussion of people of color. All right, with people of color, who? The Tupi speakers, the Indians, the local people. However, we can say here that in general, the Portuguese preserved this very broad meaning so as to encompass all kinds of mixed bloods. In the Spanish colonies, the term mestizo appears by 1553 in connection with Españoles, mestizos, and Indios living as vagabonds. In the same year, reference was made to the great quantity of hijos de españoles que han habido en Indias, that is, half American mixed bloods, but no special term was used. In 1548, a law made mestizas subject to the same rules as governed Spanish women in cases of adultery. From 1549 onward, many decrees referred to mestizos usually in conjunction with mulattoes, thus establishing a separation between two classes of mixed bloods. In the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, mulattoes were usually, as we shall see, of Black European and American ancestry. Mestizo, on the other hand, came to refer to those who were half Spanish and half American. Thus, usage doubtless reflects a developing racial class or caste system, since mestizos would usually be lighter and also be culturally as well as biologically more akin to Spaniards. That's what they're saying. But remember earlier, it was just two parents of different nations. Of course, there were exceptions, since many mestizos were raised as Americans and were illegitimate, but nonetheless, those raised by Spanish fathers were accorded privileges, sometimes withheld from darker persons, as well as from other mestizos. Juan de Solorzano, writing between the 1620s and 1640s, noted that the mulattoes ought to be encompassed within the general term mestizo, a term which he related back to Hibrida. Solorzano, however, by the 1640s felt that the mulattoes were called such in order to compare their origin with that of the mule, since they were more ugly and extraordinary. This latter opinion was expressed in his later Spanish version and was not found in his earlier Latin work. Whatever the validity of his argument, Spanish prejudice obviously had come to favor the lighter American mixed bloods over darker, part Black European peoples or part Indian peoples, right? Aguirre Beltran has shown that in fact mestizo could be used in Mexico for part Negroid people, right? Or part could be Black European or part Indian again, persons in the 17th century, provided that they also had American and Spanish ancestry. Nonetheless, standard usage has tended to favor restricting mestizo to American European mixed bloods until the present century, when, as will be noted later, the term has come in certain regions to be virtually equivalent to people of color. Mestizo, people of color, or to a particular culture as opposed to racial type. That is, a mestizo is one who speaks Spanish, does not live as a part of a so-called Indian group, and has some non-white ancestry, usually American. Right now, mestizo means so many other things, just like black could mean so many other things. Nonetheless, in Spain itself, the older, more general meaning of mestizo still persisted. For example, a friar who was half Black European, right, or an Indian is called a mestizo by the historian Antonio Dominguez Ortiz. Vicente Cortés, in discussing the problem of classifying Loros, states, ahora bien, right, says, thus Cortés uses mestizo for obscure colored Loros slaves, and for the mixture of Black Europeans and Muslims, and so Spaniards and Black Europeans, again, and all types of mixed bloods having a darker tint, or Black Indians, right, of their skin. In general, I think we can say that the appearance and evolution of the term mestizo in both the Spanish and Portuguese empires reflects the kind of caste-like and racialist social orders which evolved in the colonies. Terms such as Loro and Pardo were too general to meet the needs of caste societies. That ultimately Pardo survived and came to be widely used in a reflection of the extensive and complex miscegenation in the colonies and the need for a general term which could embrace all of the different kinds of mixed bloods and people of color, whose ancestry could almost never be accurately described. You see what I'm saying? He doesn't know the ancestry, so calling anybody African just because they're so-called Black or Negro is why I try to dodge that hijack here while I'm reading, guys. You know? Loro, for reasons which are not clear, died out as a color term and did not fulfill this function. Mestizo itself, especially in Mexico, Ladino in parts of Central America, and perhaps Cholo in Peru, came to be used eventually as almost the equivalent of Pardo. Thus, we have the sequence in which first the Europeans began with very general color terms, Loro, Pardo, Baso, etc. Second, when they coined many more color terms, Membrino, Cocido, Moreno, etc. Thirdly, when they invented and adopted terms for various mixed bloods, as mixed bloods, Mamaluco, Mestizo, Mulatto, Sambo. Fourth, when they attempted by means of such terms to individually categorize most types of mixed bloods. And fifth, when it all became so very complicated that they fell back upon very general terms such as Pardo, or made ones like Mestizo very nebulous. Finally, all of this occurred within a reality where the great mass of colonial people probably used all these terms in pragmatic ways based upon appearance and culture, okay, rather than upon actual ancestry. They're just basing it on their opinions and perspectives and what they're seeing, not the actual genealogy, guys. There is, of course, a considerable difference between the descriptive use of Loro and the later prescriptive use of mestizo. Loros were never subject to specific legal limits on their behavior as Loros in Spain. The same was true for most other color descriptive terms. The colonial designation of persons as mestizos, mulattoes, and later pardos was an entirely different matter. The use of these terms in the Americas was designed to identify and to limit. Okay, listen, this is a big one for the dismount. The use of these terms in the Americas was designed to identify and to limit, to control, and by and large to exclude, reclassify people, exclude, reclassification. All right, that's a major drop at the end for the dismount right there. Wow, there you go. That was a lot of info we went over in this chapter, guys. I hope you guys appreciate it. Okay, I hope you guys appreciated it. Let me see again. Again, this was chapter 4, Loros, Pardos, and Mestizos, classifying brown peoples, all right? Classifying brown peoples. And again, this was the book, Africans and Native Americans, The Language of Race and the Evolution of Red Black Peoples by Jack D. Forbes. Shout out to Jack D. Forbes, guys. I hope you found this valuable. I hope this helps for a lot of you to have context when you try to ask me about mulatto and all this stuff. I told you it has a deep, complex history. It's not one thing, all right? But it was applied to Indians, as we can see why. Two different nations, right? Or just in general, people who look a certain way, a certain type of lighter, dark color, like a brownish red, like, all the descriptions they gave us in today's readings. Appreciate you guys. I hope you liked it. Shout out to, again, my longtime followers and people who's been here the longest, sticking around all the way to the end of my readings now. I hope you guys enjoying all this, and we're learning from it, having context, putting everything together that we learned from before all these years, apply that with what we read today, all that. You guys can see how it starts coming together. That's what I'm saying. That's the hijacks that are put into us about race. We got it's more complex than what we think, and I hope this reading today helped out a little bit. All right, appreciate you guys always. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. Shout out to my new channel members. Check out my exclusive channel member only videos and my exclusive stuff on my Patreon page as well if you want to support that way. I appreciate anybody who does. Again, this was a deep reading. Shout out to Jack D. Forbes for this book. I have this book in PDF form on my Patreon page as well, in case anybody. Also, you can find it online if you like. It's a great reading. You got to just pull out the babies, touch the hijacks here and there. But in general, it's a very good reading. It has a lot of good sources. All right. Again, thanks for being here today all the way to the end. Appreciate you guys. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Oh, wow.